Hey, everybody, welcome. Glad that you're here with us tonight. I seem to be back at full strength, so we're going to have a slideshow tonight, and we're going to talk about current events and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, welcome, everybody. It's almost the end of April. Time is moving quite along. Our world is chaotic, but here we go.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So we're going to have yet another great late night stream tonight. I do want to get this out of the way. There's a lot of people who sent super chats, or I guess they're not super chats because we're demonetized, so you can't do super chats, but they sent Rumble rants, or they sent buy me a coffee, or they sent questions. I know Gabby sent a couple questions via Cash App, and they didn't get answered. And I apologize for that. I had to end the stream pretty abruptly last night. I had to go on RT and talk about the assassination attempt against Trump. So now we're back, and I will be answering the buy me a coffees and Gabby's questions. I'll be answering them tonight. So hold your horses. And and on top of that, if you can, if possible, it would be awesome if people wanted to send even more questions tonight. So that's fine. It might be a long Q&A tonight. That's okay. Seem to be back at full strength from my allergies. But yeah, we're going to follow our normal format. First, we got a slideshow, roll call, for the opening remarks. And then from there, we'll do the roll call, and then I'll answer the questions. And we're backlogged on questions, yes, but I will answer the questions people sent. So if you've got more questions you want me to answer tonight, by all means, please do send them in. Rumble Rants, Caleb Maupin 22 on Cash App. But the best way to show us some love is to go to buymeacoffee.com. Your question can be as long as you want. Just a great way to interact with the show. So send questions for the second half of the show. After I do my opening remarks, after we do the roll call, then I answer your questions. Now, announcements. The big announcement we've got is we are having our 7-day training program for the Center for Political Innovation, August 12th to 19th. Now, our national convention is going to be smack dab in the middle of that on the 15th. This is in the Chicago area. From a drop to an ocean, one can join a movement. We're doing this, and I feel really, really excited about it. And people are registering, and we just had a great meeting about it yesterday, and looks like venues are getting secured, and we're making progress on that. I'm feeling very, very good. Our workshops are really something special, our 7-day training programs and stuff. So if you'd like to join us this summer, please register, and we'll get back to you. All right. We do have a vetting process, but if you would like to join us, a couple people have already registered. Please register. I do want to say a lot of great things are happening with the Center for Political Innovation right now. I recorded an episode this morning with Academic Agent. That'll be airing on Thursday. Keep your eye out for that. On that episode, I plugged something else that we've got coming up, which hopefully you'll be hearing about very soon. You'll hear about it on Thursday if you don't hear about it any other time. And we've got some activities coming up. I can't tell you everything we've got in the works, kind of like, how when we blocked the No Kings Parade, if I had announced that we were going to do that on here, why we wouldn't have been able to do it now, would we have? And look how epic that was. We blocked the No Kings Parade in New York City. That was pretty epic. Well, we got something else coming up. It's not going to be as dramatic as blocking a parade, but we got some anti-imperialist activism coming up in different parts of the country, and great things are happening. So I really love the Center for Political Innovation. If you want to join us at our 7-day training workshop this summer, in August, feel free to do so. Feel free to register. You want to become a member, join on the website. And yeah, we're always doing great stuff. The Center for Political Innovation, CPI, is the future. So yeah, join an anti-imperialist movement. Here's a little video about CPI. Yep. Center for Political Innovation. We are always doing great stuff. We are building an anti-imperialist movement, which is what is urgently needed in our time, which we'll be talking about from one particular angle tonight. But before I do that, I'll just remind you, we'll be following our normal format tonight. First, the opening remarks, then the roll call, then I answer your questions. We have a lot of questions to answer that needed to be answered over the weekend, and we didn't get to them, but that's okay. So if you got a question for the second half of the show, buymeacoffee.com/Caleb Maupin is the best way to send it. You can also do Rumble Rants. You can also Cash App. Both of them work. So that's the way we do things. Looks like I'm getting over my allergies, folks. You know, one little bit at a time. I woke up this morning with a lot more energy, and that made me think it was time to jump into a slideshow. You know, so basically, we're developing the worldview that we've developed on this YouTube channel. We now call it the innovationist perspective. And it's very exciting, and it's very new, and it's very groundbreaking. We are figuring out how to build an anti-imperialist movement here in America. Not an easy thing to do. And we're pioneering new trail. And I mean, a couple things come to mind. First of which is, you know, this is a fair question. Why should you listen to me about this, right? I'm going to get on here and I'm going to talk about all kinds of history and all this. Why listen to me, right? You know, if you go to college, you may learn about these things. But if you go to college and you learn about it from Dr. Wittgenstein or Dr. Smith or Dr. Burke or Dr. Holdenfield, you know, they're going to give you a way of understanding it that will lead you to do what they do, to be part of the system, to have narratives that kind of explain the system, maybe question it a little bit. But everything that I teach on these streams is done from the perspective of we need to build an anti-imperialist movement here in the United States to rescue America from the nightmare of globalism, imperialism, and connect America to the rising new world, breaking out of the dominance of Wall Street and London. And that we need an anti-monopoly government, a government of action that fights for working families and invests in communities. We need to break the power of the big monopolies and their drive to grind nations into poverty and to preserve their rule with a low-wage police state at home and driving us toward new wars. And I am all about building a movement to oppose all of this. And that is the perspective through which I teach these concepts. And there may be other people out there that teach similar concepts to what I teach, but they teach them from a different perspective. And when I teach these concepts, I am teaching them from an activist, organizing, anti-imperialist, optimistic, constructivist, pro-humanity, pro-growth, pro-working families, pro-America perspective. I'm opposing the imperialist system, the globalist system. I'm opposing the march toward fascism and war, but I'm organizing to build a movement, and that is the perspective. And if you watch these streams and you hear me talk about these concepts, you will learn them with that perspective, and you'll be learning it from somebody who, you know, you can look at my biography. I've done quite a lot. Don't want to go over everything I've done, but you know, the amount of like heads of state that I've been consulted by and sat down with, the kinds of activism I've done over the years. You know, I tend to have a bit of credibility when it comes to these things. So that's the perspective with which I'm teaching things. And, you know, ultimately, yes, if you pay attention to what I'm teaching and you digest it properly, you will want to join the Center for Political Innovation and become Center for Political Innovation. And you want to become an activist yourself. So I mean, there's no way around that. So tonight I'm doing a series of slideshows that I'm doing, which I have an organizational purpose for them that I'm not ready to disclose necessarily. But at the same time, I'm doing these slideshows to kind of teach the basics of what it is the Center for Political Innovation is based on, what our perspective and our understanding is, the foundation of how we have come to understand the world and how we've come to understand the need to build an optimistic, pro-growth, anti-imperialist, anti-globalist, pro-working families movement in this country. So tonight, this is going to be the first of this kind of series of slideshows, and it's called From Marx to Lenin. From Marx to Lenin. And I'll just show you, I'll just show you, I guess I'll start out by just showing you why this slideshow is necessary. I don't know if you've ever heard of a YouTube channel called PragerU. There's a YouTube channel called PragerU. It is a neoconservative kind of right-wing YouTube channel. And they had a video called Who is Karl Marx? Explaining who Karl Marx is. They had a professor named Paul Kanger who teaches at Grove City College, which is a conservative college in Pennsylvania. And in the video, he's explaining who Karl Marx is. And I did a video debunking that video a long time ago. But this is one passage from the video that this is just one little clip from the video that shows why this slideshow is necessary. Here we go.
Was widely discussed and debated in European intellectual circles during Marx's lifetime, but nothing much came of it until Vladimir Lenin took power in Russia in 1917.
Now, that's not true. He says that Karl Marx wrote these ideas and it was discussed by intellectuals, but nothing came of it until 1917.
Was widely discussed and debated in European intellectual circles during Marx's lifetime, but nothing much came of it until Vladimir Lenin took power in Russia in 1917.
That is such utter ignorance. I cannot believe that this man is a political science professor. Folks, what is the ruling party in Britain right now? What is the ruling party? It's the Labour Party. Where did the Labour Party of Britain come from? Well, it came into existence long before 1917, and the Labour Party was started by Marxists. And what is one of the biggest political parties in Germany right now? It is the Social Democratic Party, the SPD of Germany. And who started it? Friedrich Engels and close associates of Karl Marx. I mean, the idea that nobody did anything about Marxism until Lenin is one of the most politically illiterate and ignorant statements I've ever heard. Marxism as a political movement in Europe was a mass movement like Europe had never seen. There were millions and millions of Marxists in Italy, in Germany, in France, in Britain, and it was Marxists who built the labor unions, and it was Marxists who demanded the right of women to vote, and it was a mass movement in the 1880s and the 1890s. And Marxism is a Western movement, and that's what I really want to get at in this slideshow tonight. Marx was Western. He was a Western thinker, and he was a product of the West. When we talk about Western civilization, a lot of people say there's no such thing as Western civilization. But when we talk about the West, we're really talking about the colonial countries, the colonizers, America, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the colonial powers, right? The ideology upon which the colonial powers, the civilization that eventually gave birth to colonialism and imperialism, that's what we can call the collective West. And Marx was very much a product of the collective West and the intellectual traditions of the collective West. But starting with Lenin, what called itself Marxism left the West. And that's a really important thing to understand. Right now, we don't think of Marxism as being a Western thing. We think of Marxism as being Chinese or Russian or Cuban. Marxism started out in Germany and in Britain, largely in Britain and Germany. Marx was from Germany. He spent a lot of time in Paris, and he ultimately lived out the final years of his life, most of his life in London, in Britain. Marxism was very, very Western. However, starting with Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution, Marxism stopped being a purely Western phenomenon, and it changed. And if we're going to make any sense of the world that we're living in, we have to understand, why is it that a Western idea, an idea that grew out of Western thought and Western civilization and the colonial powers, eventually gave birth to the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, and now we have this whole new BRICS economy emerging in the world, a lot of which doesn't even consider itself to be Marxist, and is very, very much non-Western. So how did Marxism and Karl Marx's ideas get mixed up in a movement now that is kind of a repudiation of the West? The West is losing power. The globalist, colonialist, imperialist civilization and system that emerged from the West is in decline and in severe crisis. And around the world, there's a new system arising, and that system, the foundations of the new world, were laid by people who claimed to be Marxists. But yet, Marxism is a Western idea, and increasingly, the anti-colonial movements of the world are less and less connected to what Karl Marx himself even believed. What is going on here? Nobody else can explain this, all right? At least not in America. Nobody else can explain this. We in the Center for Political Innovation can explain this, and it's going to take quite a few slideshows to really give you an answer. But tonight, we're going to start to answer that question. What is going on in the world? How did Marxism come into being in the West? How did it leave the West? What are Western values, and what in the world is wrong with the West? And Gabby, your question is on the list. We're doing all the questions tonight. We're going to catch up on questions. So, all right. So from Marx to Lenin, and we're going to start out with this slideshow from Marx to Lenin. Here we go. So Western civilization, and again, as I said, many people would argue there really is no such thing as Western civilization. But when we say the collective West or the Western system, the Atlanticist world or the NATO world, we're talking about countries that eventually that became colonizers, the colonial powers, the imperialist countries. We're talking about Western Europe, America, Australia. That's what we're talking about. Now, Western civilization can trace its roots back to ancient Greece. And ancient Greece, you had city-states, you had Socrates, you had Plato, you had Aristotle, and that Greek intellectual influence continued all the way up until the dawn of Christianity. And if you look in the book of John, the Gospel of John in the Bible, the opening of the Gospel of John is, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." What does that mean? That doesn't make any sense. All right. I mean, that is what the King James Bible actually says. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That doesn't make any sense. A word is something that is spoken. It is an article of speech. And in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What does that mean? Well, in order to understand what is being said in the first line of the Gospel of John, you have to understand that in Greek, the word for word, the word word in Greek is logos. Logos is the word in Greek that means word. And so logos in Greek doesn't only mean word, it means order. And this is very interesting, but basically language, spoken language, is a mechanism through which we bring order to the universe. We explain things, right? It's a way we put into words, we articulate. And so the ancient Greeks, their word for word and their word for order were the same. And so what the Gospel of St. John is saying is, in the beginning was order, and order was from God, and God was order. Order was God, God was order. And that is really the basis of Western civilization as it once existed, right? The foundation of Western civilization is rationalism. Is the universe defined by chaos, or is the universe defined by order? And ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates, like Plato, like Aristotle, they started to realize that, to argue that there was objective laws through which the universe could be measured. The world was defined by order. There was up and there was down. Numbers and mathematics existed. You could measure, the length of the day. You could measure how much water you had in a jar, right? That there are certain things that are not a matter of opinion. that are not simply based on feelings. There is order in the universe. There are laws of physics. There are laws of mathematics. And that was the basis upon which Western thought began, right? And this goes back to when the world was centered around the Mediterranean, right? This is the Mediterranean. And in Greece, the center of the known world at the time, the Mediterranean, the center of the known world in Greece was Delphi. And in Delphi, you had the great temple at Delphi, which was the kind of the you could say it was like the United Nations of the ancient Mediterranean world. You had all these city-states in North Africa, on the Italian peninsula, in the Middle East, in Greece. And at the center of the Mediterranean was this place called Delphi. And in Delphi, they built a temple. And this temple at Delphi was staffed by a group of guys that were called the Delphic Order or the Delphic Priesthood. And they had oracles, women that supposedly could, predict the future. There were oracles at Delphi. And all the kings from throughout the Mediterranean, from Greece and from Athens, from Sparta, from Carthage, from Persia, would all go to the temple at Delphi. And they had these women there that were called oracles, and they would blabber incoherently and give prophecies. They would speak, blah, 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 and the priesthood would interpret what the women were saying as prophecies. And so all of the ancient kings went to the temple at Delphi to get prophecies from the oracles. And the temple at Delphi was the center of the Mediterranean world. And every kingdom and every nation, every city-state went there to get what they thought was a connection to the gods, right? To get prophecy through which they could govern and rule. And the temple at Delphi didn't take sides in disputes. It was a place that every king and every nation could go to get divine wisdom. And the temple at Delphi had a priesthood that learned to speak many languages and kept many records. And the temple at Delphi, you could say, was kind of the first attempt of some kind of new world order or some kind of globalist power structure. And the people at the temple at Delphi considered themselves to be very important and well educated. They could speak many languages. They were, studying what was happening in all the different city states. They were, being consulted by all the different kings. And the temple at Delphi was very, very important. And it was the temple at Delphi and the Delphic priesthood that made Socrates famous and popularized Plato, right? Plato wrote The Republic, which was his account of the life of Socrates. And it was the Delphic priesthood that popularized and made Socrates and his teachings very famous. And that Delphi was kind of the center of the ancient world, of the Mediterranean world. And when the temple at Delphi and the temple at Delphi came into existence, Greece, Athens, Sparta, these were the powers. But throughout the hundreds and hundreds of years that the temple at Delphi was functioning as the kind of mediator between all the kingdoms and all the city-states, gradually Rome came to rule the world. So, you had the belief in rationalism, you had the temple at Delphi that was promoting Socrates, and gradually the temple at Delphi pivoted the world. The world at that point was centered around the Mediterranean, pivoted the world from the Greek city-states to the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire emerged largely as a result of kind of gradual nudging of the temple of Delphi, the Delphic priesthood. And that eventually the Roman Empire became an empire that conquered the entire known world. And it was, they talk about Pax Romana. The Romans ruled North Africa. They ruled the Middle East. They went all the way up into Britain. They ruled the entire known world, all of Europe, a lot of the Middle East, a lot of Africa was run by the Roman Empire. It was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And the Romans, they said all roads lead to Rome. And, basically the way the Roman Empire worked is that they went to various areas and kingdoms and principalities and subdued them. and then they let the local king stay in power. He just had to send them so many slaves every year, and he had to send them so many crops, food, and minerals and natural resources. And the Roman Empire was this giant empire that paved roads connecting the various areas, had a mighty navy to control the ocean, and all trade had to go through them. They were the global middleman in trade. And then, of course, the Roman Empire experienced problems, and the Roman Empire, for a number of reasons we've gotten on about in various other streams, the Roman Empire started to decline and deteriorate. It broke into two pieces, the Western and the Eastern, and eventually we had the fall of the Roman Empire. And what replaced the Roman Empire is what we call the Dark Ages, or the medieval period. And during the medieval period, you saw Europe fracturing into much smaller principalities, and you saw the Vatican playing the role that the Temple at Delphi played, right? The Vatican was this building that claimed to have divine authority, connection to God, that was neutral between all the different kings and nations, and all the different kings of the Christian world went to the Vatican and got advice from the Pope, and the Vatican kind of functioned in the same way the Temple at Delphi had functioned during the Dark Ages. And out of the Dark Ages, you eventually got the Renaissance. The Renaissance led to the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment led to modernity. So, the world was centered around the Temple at Delphi, then the world was centered around the Roman Empire, and then the world became centered around the Vatican. Now, things started to change. In 1517, you had the Protestant Reformation, where people started saying that we can be Christian without listening to the Catholic Church. We can read the Bible for ourselves. We're not going to pay indulgences. Priests can get married. You had a feeling that the Catholic Church was corrupt, was not really representing Christianity. You had Martin Luther, and you had a whole bunch of, different Protestant reformers, dissident priests and others breaking from the Catholic Church. Then in 1534, England broke with the Vatican. King Henry VIII was the king of England, and he wanted to get divorced, and the Pope was not going to allow him to get divorced, and so he broke England away from the Vatican. He established the Church of England and the Tudor monarchy, which was a very pivotal, the House of the Tudors, that's King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, and they were a really, really important, pivotal ruling family in Britain, and they funded public education, and they engaged in a lot of privatization and taking the feudal commons and turning them into private property and allowing the merchant classes to emerge. And, England eventually, was a step away from the rule of the world by the Vatican. The world was becoming less and less centered around the Vatican. 1649, you had the English Civil War, where the Parliament and the king went to war. The king was aligned with the feudal aristocracy, and the Parliament was aligned with the emerging capitalist class. And the king was aligned with the Church of England and the landed aristocracy, and the emerging capitalist class that was represented by the Parliament was led by fanatical Protestants, Roundheads. Oliver Cromwell was their leader, and you had Puritans and Muggletonians and Ranters and Quakers and Levelers and all kinds of fanatical religious groups that didn't accept the Church of England because they thought it was too much like the Catholic Church. And they fought against the King of England. They defeated the King of England. They arrested him, and they charged him with heresy for saying that he had divine right, for saying that God had given him the right to rule. They said that was heresy, and they cut his head off. And in 1649, the King of England, King Charles I, got his head chopped off by the radical Protestants. And you could say that was when England largely transitioned out of feudalism. It was a long, bloody process. Started with the break with the Vatican, with Henry VIII, all the way up to the English Civil War. 1776, the American colonies of Britain, the 13 colonies, declared independence. This is 250 years ago. You had the American Revolution. And the English colonists in Virginia and New England and Pennsylvania and New York, all of them broke away. They said, we're going to have a new country based on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You had the French Revolution of 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Another king got his head cut off, right? King Louis got his head chopped off, and they declared liberty, equality, fraternity as the values of the French Revolution. And they just declared that we're marching into a world where human rights are recognized. They briefly tried to even abolish all religion temporarily. They converted the churches to temples of science and reason. That didn't work out too well. Then you had Napoleon coming into power. That, this is all capitalism emerging from feudalism. And 1848 is the year of what they call the Spring of Nations. And that's when the values of the French Revolution spread all across Europe in revolts and uprisings that happened in every corner of Europe. In 1848, there were over 200 armed uprisings or revolutions in Europe, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Italy, and all over the so-called, what we now call the West. There were huge revolts and rebellions taking place, and they were spreading the ideals of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the English Civil War. It was a revolution to overthrow feudalism and to bring in capitalism and the modern world that we live in. And 1848 was a pivotal year. And the people leading the uprisings in 1848 were called Republicans, is what they were known as, because they were demanding the creation of republics and modern nation states, right? In Germany, the 1848 German Revolution that was defeated, the anthem of the 1848 German Revolution was Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles, Deutschland, über all das Welt. And what is that? Germany, Germany over all else, Germany over all the world. And they were German nationalists because at the time, Germany was a bunch of feudal kingdoms with local princes and kings who ruled over them. And the peasants of Germany were being oppressed by the landlords, and the people wanted their rights. They wanted freedom of religion. They wanted freedom of speech. And so they took up muskets and guns and they marched into battle demanding the creation of Germany. They wanted a modern nation state with an elected government, a republic. And there had been a long tradition. Beethoven had been a Republican and an advocate of a German nation state. And in fact, his Sixth Symphony that he wrote, the Pastoral Symphony, was dedicated to the peasantry, to the rural poor people that were being oppressed by the nobles. And he was inspired. Beethoven wanted the peasants to rise up, and his Pastoral Symphony, the Shepherd's Hymn, is this triumphant anthem. It's in his Sixth Pastoral Symphony. It's glorifying the peasants as the motor of history, driving history forward by rebelling. Beethoven also dedicated his Third Symphony, Eroica. He dedicated that to Napoleon. It was his heroic symphony. And then when he found out that Napoleon had declared himself to be an emperor, to be a monarch, he scratched it out. He took away the dedication. Because he said that Napoleon had betrayed the ideals of republicanism. So this is what's happening in Europe in the 1800s. And this is 1848, the Spring of Nations. Now, what symbol is this? Let's just talk about this. This is important. This is the symbol of Masonry, right? If you've ever known, a lot of old men are part of the Freemasons, right? It's like an old man's club now, but back in the 1700s in England and France and Scotland and, Ireland and, a lot of places in Europe, a lot of people became Freemasons. And the Freemasons were a group of people who wanted to overthrow feudalism and bring in capitalism. And they did not like the Catholic Church. They forbid Catholics from joining their ranks. And they were very, very much, you could say they were religious skeptics. Masons didn't only study the Bible, they studied the Quran, they studied the Torah, and that they were advocates of science and rationalism. And this symbol is the symbol of the Masonic order through which emerging capitalists kind of, spread their ideas. And you can see there, it's a compass and square, right? And the compass is a device for measurement that a land surveyor or a geometrist, someone using geometry might do. A square is something that a bricklayer would use. And there's a G in the middle of it. Now, what does the G stand for? Well, it stands for two things: geometry, which that makes sense, right? They got a compass and a measurement there. So they're talking about geometry. And it stands for God, because the Masons believed that God was the proof of God's existence was the laws of physics and the laws of mathematics, and they were rationalists, and they were espousing rationalism, which was the philosophy upon which Western civilization was built. But anyhow, so feudalism was being overthrown throughout Europe, and as feudalism is being overthrown, the ideas that we now associate with the so-called West, or the collective West, were emerging. Individual rights. The idea that, you have the right to say what you believe, the idea that the government shouldn't impose onto you a religion or impose onto you what you should do, that you should have the right to life, liberty, and private property. Individual rights, that's liberalism. Liberalism is the philosophy that celebrates individual rights. And liberalism was a great advance. No one anywhere in the world had talked about the right to freedom of speech or the right to freedom of religion or freedom of association. No one had ever talked about that before. But because the economy of Europe had developed to the point that there was enough stability, and because you had the emergence of a higher mode of production called capitalism, you got liberalism. Liberalism brought with it religious freedom and skepticism, right? The idea that, you can question religious authority. During feudalism, if you said that you disagreed with the Pope, you got burned at the stake for heresy. However, in the emerging liberal order that emerged out of the overthrow of feudalism, you had the right to freedom of conscience, science, and the scientific method, right? And the idea that if you're going to say something about the way that rocks are formed or the way animals exist, you got to prove it, right? The scientific method. The notion that humans are created equal. The idea that no one that we're created equal, and that your position in life should not be determined by your birth. In feudalism, you have hereditary rulers. The king rules because his father was the king, and he ruled because his father was the king. And you were a peasant because your parents were peasants, and they were peasants because their parents were peasants. And if you were a blacksmith, the only way you could become a blacksmith was if your father was a blacksmith, and the only way he could become a blacksmith is if his father was a blacksmith. And that people were born into their station in life. There was hereditary positions and hereditary titles. However, coming out of the Enlightenment, coming out of the overthrow of feudalism, we get this notion that human beings are created equal, and that there are no natural superiors, and that people with their own life, liberty, and property can be who they want to be. And if we're going to have a leader, it needs to be elected. It needs to have the consent of the government. And also on top of that is the notion of private property, right? That people have the right to own land. People have the right to own their own business. And the state should allow private business and enterprises to flourish. And this is the so-called collective West. This is Western civilization, right? This is the West. This is what the West is founded on. And many people will point out it has never been sincere, right? This notion, human beings are created equal. That did not apply to women. That was only men. If you were a woman, women were born into their position. They were considered to be naturally inferior to men. And so it didn't apply to women. And it didn't apply to non-white people either. Black people were considered to be slaves, were considered human property, and no one thought about them being created equal. They were considered to be naturally inferior. Whites were considered to be their natural superiors. So even back then, they were not really sincere about it. And, individual rights, sure, free speech, unless you say things that are a threat and causing a huge amount of, crisis in society, and then we don't allow it, right? Many of the people who founded the United States came to the United States wanting religious freedom. They were religious dissenters from England, Quakers and Roman Catholics and Puritans and others. And you look, when you get to the Americas, look at all the ugly persecution, right? Quakers were constantly being persecuted because their religious beliefs went against what other Protestants thought. If you look at Rhode Island was established by, I believe, by what was his name? I don't even remember his name, but he was somebody who said things that the Puritans in Massachusetts didn't like, and he had to flee to somewhere else. I mean, it was never sincere. These are ideas that were espoused: individual rights, freedom, scientific method, humans are created equal, no natural superiors. But they all had a but. Every one of these had a but. You have freedom of speech, but you don't have the right to shout fire in a crowded theater. You have freedom of religion unless you're living in Massachusetts and you're a Catholic, in which you don't have freedom of religion. We believe in science unless what science is saying goes against what we want. Humans are created equal except for women, except for black people and other races. Men, like white dudes are created equal. Private property, sure, we believe in private property, but the U.S. Constitution has this thing called eminent domain where the government can come and seize your property at any time. And of course, in the U.S. Constitution, all of this gets put on hold if a state of war is declared, right? If we declare war, no more freedom of speech, no more freedom of assembly. Everyone has to, obey the military if Congress declares war, and there's martial law, basically. So all of this was never complete, right? These were you could say these were aspirations upon which Western civilization was founded. We wanted to have freedom of speech. We wanted to have individual rights. We wanted all human beings to be created equal. We wanted everyone to be able to pursue happiness and start their own business and have their own private enterprise. These were aspirations upon which the West was founded, but they were never realized because they're kind of impossible, right? You can never have total freedom of speech. You can never have total religious freedom. They're all predicated on on circumstances. But anyhow, right, out of the revolutions that brought capitalism and private property into the world, there were various people that were not satisfied. There were various people who thought that they didn't get what they wanted, right? They wanted life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They wanted liberty, equality, and fraternity. They wanted a society of freedom and equality and justice for all, liberty and justice for all, and they didn't get it. There were various people throughout Europe that were disappointed with the results. And, after the French Revolution of 1789, they formed a national assembly. And the people that were still kind of loyal to the king, they sat on the right. And the people that fully embraced the ideals of the French Revolution, they sat on the left. And so leftism became associated with people that were passionate and inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution and the ideals of the Spring of Nations of 1848, the ideals of the revolutions that had come and emerged during these years. They were associated with the left. Whereas the right was people that wanted to kind of hold on to aspects of feudalism, hold on to traditional morality, hold on to loyalty to the nation, hold on to some of these hierarchies. That was the division. And the people that kind of embraced the ideals of these revolutions and wanted to create an egalitarian society with no ruling class, a society with liberty and justice for all, they were considered to be the left. And it was among what you could call the left, the people that were the most inspired by the ideals of these revolutions, that you first got the concept of socialism. Socialism was first a French word, and it was said by Pierre Leroux, and it was describing followers of a French teacher named Henry Saint-Simon. And Henry Saint-Simon was a guy in France who saw that the French Revolution, yeah, we didn't have a king anymore. Yeah, we have free speech now, but we still have big problems. And Henry Saint-Simon observed that factory and landowners were now the new aristocrats. Before, if you were a peasant, you were the property of whoever's, the noble that owned the land. Well, now, if you're a worker, your boss, who you rent yourself out to is like your new aristocrat. And if you're somebody who does not own their property, the person you rent the land from, they're your new aristocrat. The factory and landowners became the new ruling class. And that, there was freedom in the new world that had emerged, but there was harsh inequality and there were big problems. And so Henry Saint-Simon was this guy in France, and this guy, Pierre Leroux, said his teachings were called socialism, right? It comes from societyism, you could say. And he existed. After that, in England, the first person to use the word socialism in English was Robert Owen. And Robert Owen was a wealthy factory owner who really didn't like poverty. And he saw that his workers were impoverished, and he saw that there was a lot of hunger and homelessness. And so he developed what he called a model city, and he built what was called New Lanark. And it was in Scotland, it was this socialist utopian city where everyone was paid roughly the same wage, right? There was total equality where everything was owned in common. And it was like a cooperative city. He built a new Lanark in Scotland, and eventually he moved it to Indiana. And it was called New Harmony. It was a socialist commune in New Harmony. And eventually Robert Owen gave a speech to a joint session of Congress about his concept of socialism. And it was Robert Owen. And, Henry Saint-Simon, Robert Owen, and later Jean-Baptiste Fourier, these folks were what you call utopian socialists. They saw that the world that had emerged from the overthrow of feudalism still had big problems. And in the name of right and wrong, and in the name of reason, and in the name of appealing to morality, and often appealing to religion, these folks tended to be Christians. In the name of appealing to Christian values, they wanted to kind of build a model utopian alternative to capitalism. And one thing that they became aware of, it was Jean-Baptiste Fourier who first talked about it, is that capitalism had a problem that had never existed before in history. And he said, abundance becomes the source of distress and want. Poverty amid plenty, right? Glut, overproduction. The idea that people become homeless because there are too many houses. The idea that people become hungry because there is too much food. Glut on the market. That didn't make any sense. Why should abundance become the source of distress and want? So that's socialism. That's what socialism was. So now we have to talk about another thing. So as capitalism is emerging, you have something called the revolutionary intelligentsia that emerges. And it's largely made up of what they call idlers. And what is an idler? An idler is somebody who's so rich, they don't have to work. They have lots of money. And because of the emergence of capitalism, a lot of the people who owned a whole bunch of factories or owned a whole bunch of land, they made money just by owning, and they didn't have to work. And you had a layer of new people that existed who did not have to work. And you had basically a layer of rich kids, of idlers, people who did not have to work. And that the urban centers of Europe, London and Paris and Vienna and, and various urban centers became populated. You'd have gatherings of the rich people who did not have to work, and they didn't have to work. So they were kind of bored. And so they needed to be entertained. And so the idlers would gather in places called salons. And they would gather and discuss ideas, and they wanted to be entertained. And the areas that idlers lived and had their salons to discuss ideas started to be called the Bohemian Quarter, right? In France, they talked about La Bohème, right? In London, you had the Bohemian Quarter. It was a section of the city where it's a part of the city where there's a lot of cafes and theaters and bookshops and universities. And this is where you have a bunch of rich people, a bunch of rich young people usually, who don't have to work and have a lot of time to think about ideas and go to operas and theaters and read books and sit in cafes and argue about ideas. And so this Bohemian Quarters, where you had these very, very wealthy people that had a lot of time on their hands, suddenly became the places that ideas that were not widely accepted in society could be discussed. Most people during this time were working and struggling to survive, right? Most people are, people from the countryside are moving to the cities and they're working long hours in factories. They don't have time to think about philosophy or any of this stuff. But these rich idlers, they have loads of time, and they go around going to operas and sitting in cafes and listening to lectures. And so in the Bohemian Quarters, there was a huge interest in philosophy, right? Philosophy is what is truth? What is the nature of reality? There's a huge interest in occultism, right? In feudalism, if you questioned Christianity, you questioned the Catholic Church, you got burned at the stake. But now that feudalism is overthrown, you got all kinds of people that are interested in talking to the dead, right? That's called spiritualism, talking to the dead. A lot of people are interested in pre-Christian religions like paganism, right? And nature worship and animism. You have mysticism, people, trying to pray in different ways or induce trance states, hypnosis, psychoanalysis. And amid these French quarters, in addition to all the people that were into philosophy, occultism, mysticism, hypnosis, you have the emergence eventually of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. Amid all of that, there's a layer of these young idlers that are interested in socialism, right? Because they're talking about what's best for the world, right? And that the world clearly is full of injustice. And even though they're wealthy and they don't have to work, there's clearly a lot of poor people begging on the street. And the world has a lot of injustice, and they've got all the time in the world to sit in the cafes and talk about it. And so among the wealthy idlers, you have a lot of young people that are interested in socialism. One of these young idlers was a guy named Friedrich Engels. And Friedrich Engels, he was the son of a wealthy factory owner, and he was very interested in socialism. And in 1842, he very briefly met a guy named Karl Marx who had a newspaper in Germany. It was just an offhand meeting. Nothing really came of it. But 2 years later, in August of 1844, Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, this newspaper writer guy, this socialist intellectual, they spent 10 days together in a cafe in Paris, right? You want to talk about rich people, right? A lot of time on their hands. They had 10 days to just sit in the Café de la Régence in Paris, and they talked to each other for 10 days straight. This is when Friedrich Engels was 24 years old, not an old man, quite a young guy. And I believe Karl Marx was roughly the same age. And they sat in this cafe for 10 days together, and they talked about it, and they became lifelong collaborators. And luckily enough, Friedrich Engels had loads of money. Karl Marx didn't have that much money, but he was a good writer and he had a reputation. And the two of them became lifelong collaborators, with Friedrich Engels using his family's money to pay for Karl Marx's writing about philosophy and politics and economics, and to pay for Karl Marx's unique brand of socialism. Marx was not like these other socialists who had come before him, and he made a really big point of explaining why his brand of socialism was special and unique, right? There were all kinds of other socialists: Henry Saint-Simon, Robert Owen, Proudhon, Joseph Proudhon, a lot of them. Marx, however, he had a particular interpretation of socialism. And Marx's career, it started out in philosophy. He was very much a Hegelian, a follower of Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher. There was a divide between the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians. He was a left Hegelian that embraced the ideals of the French Revolution. And out of his writing on philosophy, Marx got political. In 1848, he published the Communist Manifesto. In 1851, he was heavily involved in political turmoil in Paris and elsewhere. And then finally, he went into exile in London, and he spent the final years of his life writing about economics. And he studied at the British Museum, and he got all kinds of statistics, and he wrote Capital, right? Das Kapital, right? And so Marx went from philosophy to politics to economics. And what did Marx believe? Well, first, starting out as a philosopher, he believed that there was he believed in dialectical materialism. He took two different philosophical concepts and combined them, right? The first concept that he talked about was the Hegelian dialectic, right? The idea that conflict drives history forward, and that contradiction between different groups is the motor force of history, the dialectic. And then there was the debate between the materialists and the idealists. The idealists said it was the mind that creates reality. The materialists said that all that exists is matter, and the mind is merely a reflection of the matter. So he combined the Hegelian dialectic and the concept of change coming through struggle, combined that with the Greek materialism that said that thought is inseparable from matter that thinks, and he developed a philosophy called dialectical materialism. The idea is that all that exists is matter. There is no spiritual force. The mind is simply a reflection of matter. However, matter is constantly in a state of conflict and tension, and it's conflict and tension that drives forward history. And dialectical materialism, the understanding of a world that exists but is constantly changing and in motion and constantly clashing with itself, that led to a concept of historical materialism. And historical materialism argued that human history is advancing, and that human beings have been constantly reinventing the mode of production, reinventing their methods of economics, rising to a higher plane, increasing their population, increasing their life expectancy. That human beings are constantly driving forward to a more advanced plane, and that human civilization has gone from hunter-gatherer civilization to slavery to feudalism, and ultimately capitalism has emerged from it. And that Marx argued that, his understanding of socialism was that socialism would come about as a result of the struggle between the factory owner, the capitalist, and the employee or the wage worker, right? The worker, the proletarian. And that there would be a conflict between the two, and that conflict, being the driving force of history, would lead to the workers taking control of society and then organizing the economy in a way that was for the benefit of all. Marx saw socialism emerging from the struggle between employees and employers, not as an appeal to reason. And that's really what defined Karl Marx. The labor movement was a new, exciting thing, right? You had labor unions forming around the world, workers coming together and demanding their boss pay them a higher wage, going on strike to demand higher pay. Marx said the labor movement is how we're going to get socialism. It is going to be a workers' revolution. All the other socialists had said, we're going to just appeal to what's right and wrong. We're going to say socialism is just better, is just moral, more rational. Marx is saying, no, it's going to be a conflict. It's going to be the employees and the wage workers rising up against the capitalists. That is how we're going to get socialism. And Marx had quite a long career. In 1851, he was living in Paris, and there were huge working class uprisings and huge revolts in the streets. And ultimately, in 1851, Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, became the military dictator. And Marx was living in Paris and participating in these strikes and protests and writing pamphlets. And he observed it, and he developed an understanding of when there is a long-term capitalist crisis, the liberal open societies of the West collapse into authoritarianism. And that's called Bonapartism. And it is the natural result of a capitalist crisis. And he wrote a pamphlet on that, 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which is a very good pamphlet about how French society collapsed into authoritarian illiberalism amid a capitalist crisis. You had the International Working Men's Association. He had the idea that the workers of Europe and the labor unions and the working class movement should all come together all across Europe. All one workers of the world unite. So he formed the International Working Men's Association. Karl Marx was a big supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the struggle to defeat slavery in North America. And he organized mass to stand in solidarity with the American government defeating the Confederates, to refuse to pick cotton, to work with cotton picked by slaves. In America, August Willich, who was a brigadier general in the Union Army, was a Marxist who had worked with Karl Marx in Germany, had moved to the United States, and he rose to the rank of brigadier general. And that Karl Marx wrote for the New York Tribune, which was the New York City Republican Party aligned newspaper back in the 1860s. And Karl Marx was their main European and London correspondent. And 1871, there was an uprising in Paris. France was invaded by the Prussians, and the French government surrendered. And the people living in Paris didn't want to be occupied by the Prussians, so they formed their own government and continued fighting the Prussian invaders. And that was called the Paris Commune. And it was an attempt to build a kind of revolutionary working class government in 1871. And Marx called it the first dictatorship of the proletariat. He said the communards were storming heaven. The most important thing to remember about Karl Marx is that Karl Marx was an activist. Okay, and this is what a lot of people miss. If you go to college, it's very common in college that they'll offer a class on Marxism, and people will take it and they'll be bored out of their minds. And they will just say, what the hell is this? And they'll try to make sense of Karl Marx's pamphlets. And the reason that the college students are almost always disappointed by the class that they take on Marxism is because of the fact that the professor who is teaching it is not teaching it as an activist. Karl Marx was an activist. He was involved in the struggle to overturn feudalism in the German Revolution of 1848. He was running through the woods with a musket, trying to overthrow feudalism in Germany. After that, he was involved in organizing labor unions. After that, he was involved in the streets of Paris and the uprisings in 1851. After that, he was involved in building the International Working Men's Association. After that, he was involved in organizing mass meetings to oppose slavery and have solidarity with the Union Army during the American Civil War. After that, he was raising money for the Paris Commune, and he was helping smuggle survivors of the Paris Commune out of Paris and into London, where they could live in exile after they'd been involved in the Paris Commune. And after that, he was involved in helping found the German Social Democratic Party. Marx was organizing. And everything that Marx wrote served an organizational purpose. He wrote his books so that people would form organizations to bring the working class to power. It was not abstract philosophy. And if you approach it as if it is abstract philosophy, you will not understand it. If you're not reading Marx from the understanding of this guy was trying to build a mass movement to defeat slavery, to build labor unions, if you don't read it that way and you don't understand the context of it, it seems like gobbledygook, and it's very incoherent and it's very weird. But if you understand that every one of those pamphlets and books is written from the perspective of a guy who's trying to build a movement, and you look at what was happening at the time and you get the context of the movement, right? You understand that the pamphlet, The Poverty of Philosophy, was him explaining my kind of socialism is better than this guy Proudhon's kind of socialism, and comparing them and saying, you should follow my scientific socialism, not the philosophy of poverty of Proudhon. If you understand that the critique of the Goethe program is that a group of Germans wrote a communist manifesto for their new party, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and Karl Marx read it and said, no, they got it all wrong, and he wrote Critique of the Goethe program. You can understand that in 1851, the French government was overthrown and became a military dictatorship. And Karl Marx was there in the streets as people were battling each other, and they formed mobs of homeless people to go out and scream and fight with soldiers. And he was in the middle of all of this trying to make sense of it. Then you can understand what Marx was writing. But if you don't have the activist context and you don't think like an activist, it doesn't make sense to you. And that's one of the most important things about Marxism that I was ever taught, right? That if you don't understand Marx was an activist, it doesn't make sense. Okay. So what is Marx's teaching on economics? Well, the teaching on Marxist economics, it fits in with his view of historical materialism. It's that history is marching forward, right? And that basically human beings are constantly reinventing their relationship with nature, inventing better technology. And as they have a technological revolution, they invent a new form of technology. The result is the creation of a new class. So first you have a technological revolution. The technological revolution leads to a social revolution, the creation of a new class. And eventually the government of the old system gets in the way. And so the new class that emerges has to overthrow it and create a new government. So there's a political revolution. And that there's this three phases that go on as society advances. As human beings advance technology, the technology leads to the creation of a new class, and the new class then has to create a new government. And that, the first example of that was hunter-gatherer civilization. Somebody thousands and thousands of years ago figured out that we needed to grow our own food. They had a technological breakthrough. They invented crops, and they invented domesticating animals. And this was a technological revolution. And in order to do that, they had to say, this is my animal and this is my tract of land. And so they became a landowner, and they created a new class called landowners. And then those landowners then had to create a government centered around their right to own land and to own people on the land. And so you got a new political system out of the hunter-gatherer tribal civilization. You got slavery. And this new system of people who own land and people who own livestock and people who own people emerged out of that. And then out of that, you eventually got feudalism. You had serfs, right? And serfs came into existence, right? I mean, and out of that, eventually you get capitalism, and that it's a technological revolution followed by a social revolution that ultimately then results in a political revolution. This is how history is driven forward. And that in the modern capitalist world, you had wage workers, proletarians, and you had capitalists, right? Those who owned factories, basically, factory owners of means of production. But capitalism had a problem called overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profits, poverty amid plenty. And I have talked about this many times, but this is something Marx spent a lot of time writing about. Right, I'll put the video on, the socialist math video.
What needs to be explained, what used to be considered Marxism 101, about why it is that our Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do some math. And I hate math. Do you know why I hate math? Because I grew up in America. I went to public school in the United States of America. So I am going to, at risk of embarrassing myself, because math was never my best subject, I'm going to do some mathematics here on the board for you to explain the problem.
We very much enjoyed Caleb's speech.
So if you are creating a product, right? If you're a factory owner, you're making a product, you are going to need the material through which that product is made, the manufacturing materials. So that'll be A.
The simple equation you put forward to explain the crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit.
And you're probably going to need to transport the product to where it's sold. That's B.
It broke down where your money goes.
You're also going to have to pay your labor costs. Labor costs are represented by C.
Explanations of those concepts that people are able to understand.
Then when consumers purchase the product, they're going to pay a final price. And that final price is D. However, there's a problem with that.
I like the fact that he framed it that way to make it very clear.
Which is that the capitalist can't change how much A costs. He can't change how much B costs. So the profit of the capitalist can only be extracted from the value put into it by the worker. And this is the basis of Marxism, the understanding of surplus value.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere. I've never been able to explain it that simply.
So C, the labor value, is divided. You have C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid. And then you have C2, which is the profit that the capitalist makes. And it all adds up to D, which is the final cost of the product. Now, the way people in the United States who talk about Marxism generally talk about this is they say, well, this is unfair. They say the worker is not getting paid the full value of his labor. But they're missing one of the most important points, which is not just that it's unfair and then people argue, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve to be? That's all a distraction. Because the important thing to understand is this. C1 is always going to be less than D. The wages paid out to the worker are never enough to buy back the product that he produces. There is always more products created than there are wages paid out to the worker. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, the problem of overproduction. And it is always there in the capitalist economy. It never goes away. And they have invented all kinds of crazy mechanisms to try and deal with the problem of overproduction. Part of the reason that the US government has purchased billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese only to bury it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri, is to deal with this problem. It is an ongoing present problem, and it's a problem acknowledged by most capitalist economists. John Maynard Keynes said the problem was underconsumption rather than overproduction, but he was pointing to the same problem. The military-industrial complex in the United States is an effort to deal with this problem, to keep spending going. There's all kinds of mechanisms that they've invented to try and resolve this problem, but it gets worse. What is the capitalist always trying to do? He wants to maximize the amount of profit he makes. And one of the main ways they do that is with what's called labor-saving technology. Get rid of workers and replace workers with machines. As they eliminate workers from the process of production, as there's fewer and fewer workers involved, as machines take the place of workers, the role of C in production decreases. There's a little bit of a problem with that. As C goes down, C2 also goes down, right? As C decreases, C2 also decreases. And as the role of the worker in production is reduced, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes goes down. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Only human labor creates value. And this is something that Adam Smith acknowledged. This is something some of the popes even acknowledge. Human labor creates all value. And so when you reduce the role of human labor in production, the amount of value created decreases, and the ability of the capitalist to extract surplus value also decreases. So this causes the capitalist to have to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit on the overall product. He's making less and less of a percentage, so he has to churn them out. So this problem of the worker never being able to buy back what he produces and more products being created than are necessary, this problem becomes exacerbated. And this points to what is understood to be the deeply irrational nature of the capitalist system.
Yeah. So this problem of technology advancing and technological advancement leading to great economic hardship, this problem of less and less workers being needed at the assembly line and thus workers not being able to buy back what they produce and the market being glutted with products that cannot be sold. And that every time capitalism becomes more efficient, it leads to big economic problems. Marx predicted that eventually it was going to lead to so much suffering that the working class would have to come together and they would, quote, seize control of the state and win the battle for democracy. And he called that dictatorship of the proletariat, that the government that we currently have is run by those with the money, but the impoverished and suffering working class would get so desperate and there'd be so many poor, struggling working class people, they'd have no choice but to band together and seize control of the state. And then once they seized control of the state, they would centralize the instruments of production. And that was called the lower stage of communism or socialism, where they would establish a centrally planned economy that didn't operate on the basis of the profits of private owners, but rather operated on the basis of the good of society. And then out of that, the springs of cooperative wealth would flow more abundantly. And this problem of overproduction and poverty amid plenty would go away because you had a rationally and centrally planned economy. And as the result of that, the springs of cooperative wealth would flow more abundantly. And you'd get so much wealth that you wouldn't need a government, that everyone would pretty much be equal because there was enough to go around for everybody. And that was called the higher stage of communism. And that's the Marxist economic teaching. There's a big contradiction between Marx's philosophy and Marx's economics. Marx's philosophy is all about rebellion. Conflict is the driving force of history. Ruthless criticism of all in existence. His hero was Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods. He said his ideal state of being was to fight and that conflict defines reality. So Marx wants to tear apart order, right? He doesn't like order. He wants chaos and instability. But yet his economic philosophy is saying that capitalism, what he's opposed to, lacks order. And he wants to abolish what he calls the anarchy of production. He wants to centralize production. So on the one hand, Marx is saying, I want chaos. I want instability. I am rejecting order. I'm rejecting logos. On the other hand, Marx is saying, I want to create pure order. I want to create an economic system that is rational and ordered so that everyone has what they need. And that Marx wants two different things. Part of him wants chaos and part of him wants order. And that is a big contradiction in the Marxian worldview, right? And that really kind of gets back to the rationalism versus irrationalism debate, right? Western civilization is founded on the notion of rationalism. And Marx's economic view is very rationalist, yet his spiritual and philosophical view is very irrationalist, and that Marx has a touch of irrationalism and a touch of rationalism. He doesn't quite know what he wants. On the one hand, he wants irrationalism. He wants to declare war on everything that exists. He wants rebellion and chaos and tearing things asunder. On the other hand, he wants absolute order and absolute centralization, and so much order and centralization that there's no inequality and there's vast abundance for all. That's a big contradiction in the Marxist worldview. Now, after Marx's death, things escalated. Now, before Marx died in 1875, the German Social Democratic Party was formed. Then in 1889, you had the Second International that was formed. That was, you'd had Marx's International Working Men's Association, you had the Second International. And in the 1880s, social democracy exploded across Europe. All over Europe, people were interested in Marxism and socialism. It was a mass movement because the labor movement, the movement of factory workers against their employers, was exploding, was rising. And Marxism stated that its goal was to lend the economic struggle a political character, meaning that they were a political party that gave political expression to the struggle of workers against their employers, the economic struggle. They wanted to give a political character to the economic struggle. And that was kind of the debate. There were other trends at the time, right? There was what you called syndicalism. And those were people that said, no, we don't want to change the laws. We just want to fight our employers on the job, the syndicalists. But Marxists said, no, we want to form a working class political party aligned with the labor unions that will fight for the working class and lead to the working class eventually coming to power in a revolution. And that's what social democracy, or the Second International, was striving to do. They were a working class political movement of industrial workers battling their employers, forming political parties that passed laws to make life better for the working class, building organizations like marching bands and choirs and kindergartens and all kinds of organizations so that eventually the working class would overthrow the capitalists and establish socialism and eventually communism. In about 1897, everyone noticed something was off. And this was what they called the crisis of Marxism. It wasn't happening. There were millions of people that were Marxists. There were all kinds of Marxists elected to parliament, and there were all kinds of socialist groups, and labor unions were exploding in membership, and it wasn't happening. There wasn't a revolution. And in fact, Marx had predicted that there would be more and more unemployment and more hunger and poverty and more instability in capitalism. And that would lead to the revolution. And in fact, at the same time that Marxism was growing in popularity, capitalism was becoming more and more stable. And there were a lot of working class people that were seeing their living standard go up, not down. And the economy was having less economic crises. Something was off. And in 1897, all the Marxists started saying, okay, we're having a crisis of Marxism because history is not going as Marx said, and our movement is very, very big, but it's not producing the revolution that it was supposed to create. If our movement, something's off. There were three interpretations of the crisis of Marxism. The first was what was called revisionism. It was started by Edward Bernstein. The movement is everything, and the goal is nothing. And that was the idea that the reason that capitalism was becoming more stable was it was already kind of turning into socialism. The fact that they had universal male suffrage. Every man got to vote, no matter how much money he had. Well, eventually the worker would outvote the capitalist. The fact that they had universal public education in places like Germany, they had kindergartens, and the fact that there was a 12-hour workday, it showed that working class democratic power within capitalism was kind of overhauling the irrational nature of the capitalist system, and that capitalism in the West was just naturally kind of evolving into socialism. And that's why you weren't seeing a revolution, and there was never going to be a revolution. The movement is everything. The goal is nothing. And revolution, according to the revisionist or Bernstein approach, revolution is just the sum of reforms. One day we'll have an 8-hour workday, and the next day we'll have free healthcare, and gradually it all just kind of leads up to socialism. And socialism emerges gradually, one step at a time. And, it'll eventually, 300-400 years in the future, we'll look back and say, we've been socialist for a while. That Marx was right about that. That's the revisionist worldview. They called it evolutionary socialism. And it was a way to explain the crisis of Marxism, that Marx had it wrong in expecting there would be a revolution, that we're already kind of halfway there already because working class people can vote. And that's the revisionist worldview. There was a second worldview of a guy named George Sorel. And George Sorel was a French Marxist, a revisionist Marxist, and eventually he aligned himself with the syndicalist movement. And he said that the reason there was not a revolution was that Marxism was losing its spiritual power. And I honestly think that George Sorel's writing is underrated, generally because of the fact that Lenin came along and kind of overshadowed George Sorel, and the fact that there were a lot of fascists who drew from George Sorel. A lot of Western Marxists don't study George Sorel. What George Sorel was saying, it was kind of an alternative critique, and it overlaps with what Lenin said, which is he said these political parties in Europe, they're watering Marxism down into nothing. They're building these mass organizations that anybody can join, mass labor unions, mass political parties, and they don't have any power. There's no oomph behind them. And that history isn't made, according to George Sorel, by everybody. It's made by the vanguard. It's made by the advanced, right? He calls them the warrior caste, right? And he says that society is divided between the sheep, the average people that just live their lives, and the decadent rich, the ruling class, the evil ruling class. But there's a third layer of what he calls the warrior caste, of people that are inspired by the spiritual power of violence and the spiritual power of myth. And with inspiration from violence and mythology, they go out and change the world. And he goes through the history of the world, and he argues Christianity is a great example of that, right? That in ancient Rome, you had the slaves and the poor people, and you had the decadent ruling class. But then Jesus and the Apostle Paul came along, and they, went out, and there was a very violent story of Jesus being nailed to a cross, and they got persecuted and tortured, and they believed in this powerful religion, and they changed the world. And he talks about ancient Greece, and he talks about ancient Rome, and he argues that it's not about building a mass movement that includes everybody. It's about building a warrior caste that will use spiritual power, the power of violence and the power of myth, to change the world. Now, that's the Sorelian critique. And he says that the reason you're not seeing a revolution is because the Marxist parties of Europe have watered it all down into nothing. They've created this group that anybody can join, that, it's fun for the whole family, marching band, choir, socialist congress, socialist daycare, socialist kindergarten, and that, no, they should be building a movement of fanatics, of isolated fanatics who are giving the whole of their lives and spiritually committed to violence. That's how we're going to change the world. That's what George Sorel argues. Very interesting, right? And then, but ultimately, it was Vladimir Lenin and also Rosa Luxemburg. They said kind of the same thing. Not exactly. They overlapped. But Lenin had his theory of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Rosa Luxemburg had her theory of capital accumulation. They came up with an economic explanation of why Marxism was in crisis. And basically, capitalism had moved into its monopoly stage of imperialism. And basically, banks had become superior over industries. You had the rise of finance capital, of banks that dominated industries. And what you had now was the export of capital. It used to be countries sold commodities. Countries sold tires, or they sold oil or whatever. Now countries export the whole corporation. Corporations, monopolistic corporations, spread across the world, stretching their tentacles, right? That instead of exporting products, we have the export of the corporations themselves, the export of capital. And that had led to the rise of an international financial oligarchy, bankers dominating the whole world, monopolistic bankers dominating the whole world and spreading their tentacles all over the world and engaging in territorial partition, seizing parts of the world as captive markets to dump products on, seizing their natural resources, territorial partition. This is Lenin. He comes along, he says capitalism has completely changed. Rosa Luxemburg says very similar things in her writing on capital accumulation. But it's basically that we don't live in a world of factory owners and factory workers anymore. We live in a world of bankers dominating the entire world and seizing parts of Africa and Asia and South America for themselves and making super profits by building these monopolistic banking entities that control industries. And that's the stage we're in, and that that part of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, was the emergence of what was called the aristocracy of labor, which is a layer of well-paid workers at home who are loyal to empire. And that as the living standards in America and France and Germany were rising, a layer of the working class there was not feeling revolutionary anymore. They didn't want to go out and have a revolution because their life was getting better. And they would align with their government against the colonized people of the world. And the USA invaded the Philippines. And, they took it from Spain. And then the people of the Philippines rose up and they had the Philippine-American War. And many Americans supported the government of America occupying the Philippines, slaughtering civilians in the Philippines, because they said that, it was in their interest. They wanted America to dominate the world. And, Britain colonized India and colonized big chunks of the African continent. And a lot of British workers supported that because they wanted the British Empire, the empire of freedom, to dominate the world. And they wanted British super profits. And that the aristocracy of labor was working class people who got a higher standard of living. And with the crumbs from the monopolist table, their loyalty to empire was purchased. And that the aristocracy of labor also resulted in what Lenin called social imperialism, the fake socialists, that they were leaders of the labor movement, leaders of the socialist movement, whose job was to rally the working class to support imperialism. And they talked like socialists, and they led labor unions, and they published socialist magazines, and they called themselves socialists, but they served imperialism. They preached socialism, but they were servants of imperialism. The bourgeois labor party, social democracy, social imperialism. That was a big part of what made imperialism work. Without what Lenin called the bourgeois labor party, you couldn't have imperialism. Fake socialists, fake socialist leaders, liberal, social democratic, reformist leaders who were loyal to imperialism, they were an essential part of what made this new stage of capitalism work. And Lenin fumed with anger at these people. Read Imperialism and the Split in Socialism. It's a 10-page essay by Lenin where he rants against the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders and the Jacobins and the Brian Beckers of his day. He fumes with rage at them because he says World War I would never have happened if it wasn't for the aristocracy of labor, if it wasn't for the social democrats, if it wasn't for the Second International and the Marxist movement of Germany and France and Britain and America becoming bankrupt and marching workers off into war, the horrendous event known as World War I would never have happened, right? And Lenin says, we don't want a seat at their table. We instead want to go lower and deeper to the real masses. That's what we need to do, lower and deeper to the real masses. And Lenin is furious about how imperialism is dominating the world. Imperialism led to this horrendous event called World War I, where 20 million workers were sent to their deaths. And in addition to that, around the world, colonized people in Africa, people in Asia, they are fighting for their national liberation from imperialism. And in third world countries, the capitalists divide between the comprador bourgeoisie that works with the imperialists to loot the country and the national bourgeoisie that are capitalists, but they want to break their country out of imperialism. And that national liberation movements are the vehicle through which socialism is going to come into the world. This is a complete break. What Lenin says here, this is all a complete break from Marx. Marx had said it was the workers versus the employer. Marx had said it was factory owners versus their employees. Lenin is saying, well, actually, now it's bankers. And they're not just exploiting their workers. They're super exploiting the entire world with territorial partition and international financial oligarchy. And that the socialist movement in the Western countries is corrupt and actually part of this. And that it's going to be these national liberation movements of colonized people that include capitalists. That's going to be how we get socialism in the world. It's going to be national liberation movements where the national bourgeoisie and the peasantry and the working class come together to drive out the imperialists. That's how we're going to get socialism. That's a big, big break. And people don't realize this. And this gets kind of glossed over because Lenin spent a lot of time trying to convince the Marxists he was the real Marxist. And so he emphasized ways that Marx agreed with him, but there's just no way around it. What Lenin believed with his theory of imperialism, it was a complete break with what Marx had taught. Marx had said that it was going to be in the Western countries. Marx had said that colonialism was progressive because it was bringing development to the third world and laying the basis for them to have a working class. Marx had said, class struggle, workers versus employers. And Lenin comes along and he says national liberation movements. He says we're fighting the imperialists. He says that the labor movement in the Western countries is corrupted and is part of imperialism. This is a big break, right? And this is important because I'm telling you that the West produced Karl Marx, but with Lenin, we saw Marx start to leave the West. What Lenin is teaching here, this is not a pro-Western view, right? This is not the view that the West is the best. This is not the view that the Western civilization is the most advanced. Lenin is saying that the West is holding back humanity. The West is the center of imperialism. And he's supporting the colonized people, the national liberation movements of the East against the West. This is a total break with the standard Marxist view. And Lenin was right? I don't think Lenin was wrong at all, but it wasn't standard Marxism. And it was a break. Lenin was a Russian guy who was a Marxist, and he developed a spin-off of Marxism that served Russia breaking out of the Western system. He developed his own unique spin-off interpretation of Marxism. And it wasn't just his economic theory of imperialism that was a break with what Marx taught. It was also his organizational method. So in Russia, you had various revolutionary intellectuals, people that were inspired by the French Revolution, who wanted to overthrow the Tsar and establish, and liberty, equality, fraternity. And among them, you had socialists. And the first current was called the Narodniks, and they were the agrarian socialists. They wanted the peasants to rise up against their landlords. And the Narodniks wanted to build an agrarian socialist society. They became kind of a joke in Russia. Very, very wealthy, rich kids would go and live among the peasants and wear ragged clothes, try to inspire the peasants to revolt. And out of the failure of the agrarian peasant socialist movement in Russia, the Narodnik movement, you got terrorism. And terrorism was the idea that in order to inspire the people to overthrow the Tsar and create a socialist society, they would carry out bombings and assassinations, theatrical acts of violence. Well, that didn't work. I mean, Tsar Alexander II was killed, and there was a lot of various terrorist assassinations and bombings, and that didn't inspire a revolt. And it was out of the failure of terrorism that you got the first Marxists in Russia, Plekhanov. And it was Plekhanov was the guy who started the Russian Marxist movement. And Marxism said that it would be the struggle of the factory worker against the employer that would bring socialism to Russia. And Plekhanov was the father of Russian Marxism, and he built what was called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And just like the European Social Democrats, his aim was, he said, he would lend the economic struggle a political character. A group of workers are on strike, and they go and they say, well, hey, we support your union, and we want to form a political party that will support the workers. Right? That was what the Russian Marxist movement did. It was about lending the economic struggle a political character. Well, in the Russian Marxist movement, you got a guy named Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin's older brother had been executed, hanged for trying to kill one of the czars. And Vladimir Lenin came from a very revolutionary family that had been involved in this kind of idler politics, right? Of, the revolutionary intelligentsia, etc. And Lenin was this kind of socially awkward and obsessive individual who, thought about nothing but revolution 24 hours a day, had panic attacks and was very emotional. He spoke with a lisp. He was not a very good speaker. He was kind of shy, and he got very, very worked up. And he developed this theory in 1903 of how to build a new political party, a party of new type that would engage in democratic centralism, where all the people in the group would do the same thing. They would debate among themselves, but once a decision had been made, every member was obligated to carry out the decision or else leave the party, right? They would march as one, democratic centralism. And not everyone would be part of this party of a new type. It would be only for those who were willing to give the whole of their lives, those who would function as professional revolutionaries, the party of new type, democratic centralism. And Lenin said that this party of new type would engage in agitation and propaganda, right? And he differentiated between the two. Agitation was just stirring people up to rebel. An agitator says, aren't you really mad? I'm mad. We got to fight. I'm so mad about this system. It's agitating. And then propaganda is teaching the Marxist philosophy, and that you agitate the masses and you propagate to the advanced. And eventually the Bolsheviks developed two newspapers. They had an agitational daily newspaper called Pravda, The Truth. And it was a newspaper that was widely distributed. There was mainly very short articles where people described stuff they were really, really mad about, their factory conditions, mad about the war, mad about injustice. And it was short little, they called it workers' correspondence about their conditions, right? And that was Pravda, the daily newspaper. And then they had a theoretical journal, a magazine full of ideological articles explaining their ideology and their Marxist philosophy, called Iskra, or the Spark, right? And so you agitate to the masses. They distributed Pravda to everybody. They wanted everyone to read it and get really mad and rise up and revolt. And then they found the best and the brightest, the smartest people, the people that were leading struggles. They found the natural agitators in the workplace, and they recruited them, and then they gave them Iskra, and they taught them the Marxist philosophy. They propagated to the advanced. You agitate the masses, you propagate to the advanced. And The Bolsheviks rejected tailism, right? Because at the time, what the Marxists generally did is if there was an uprising or a protest that happened somewhere, they would run to it and say, ooh, we support you, we support you. And, that was what they did. Something would happen on its own, spontaneously by itself. And then the Marxists would run chasing after it, tailing after it. Ooh, we support you. Yeah, we're on your side. It's called tailism. And bowing to spontaneity. Things happen spontaneously and they chase after them. And economism, right? Assuming that it's just about labor union struggles, right? Not teaching anybody anything, just kind of saying, we support labor unions, right? Lending the economic struggle a political character, right? They were just saying, look, labor unions are good and we're a political party that supports labor unions. You read What Is to Be Done by Lenin, he's ranting against this method, this tailism, this bowing to spontaneity. He says we need a highly disciplined organization that will engage in agitation and propaganda that will lead a revolution. 1905, you had the Russian Revolution of 1905, a mass uprising throughout the country. 1912, the Bolsheviks expelled the Mensheviks and they formed their own party, the Party of New Type. Now, Trotsky didn't go along with it. He formed the August Bloc. That's a whole nother story. The Bolsheviks emerged to be this very, very strong political movement in Russia. When World War I began, they were against it. They were against it. They were against World War I. They said that, that World War I, where Russia was fighting on the side of the British and the Americans against the Germans, that was a war of the imperialists. It was not a war for the working class. And they said, down with the war. And the Mensheviks supported the war. And a lot of the socialist movement largely supported the war. But the Bolsheviks, they were the anti-war guys. They opposed the war. They were against the war. And during the war, there was a political crisis and there was a general strike that spread throughout the country, and Tsar Nicholas II was forced to step down. And you had the February Revolution where the Russian government was overthrown, and you got a provisional government that came into power. The Tsar had been forced to step down. And Lenin was living in Switzerland at the time because Switzerland was neutral and it was a place Lenin could be, because if he was in Russia, he would have been arrested for opposing the war. And Switzerland was where a lot of anti-war socialists were hiding during World War I. And in Switzerland, Lenin was living in Switzerland. And in February, after the Tsar was overthrown, Lenin got a knock on his door from got a knock on his door from, what is his name? Now his name is escaping me. Who is it who knocked on his door? Who knocked on his door when he was in exile? What is his name? He was the, what do you call it? He was the, oh my goodness, who is it? The Parvis, Alexander Parvis. Alexander Parvis, who was a member of the German parliament, who was a member of the German Social Democratic Party. Alexander Parvis knocked on Lenin's door and basically, as a representative of the German intelligence services and the German secret police, gave Lenin lots of money and safe passage back into Russia, with the understanding that Lenin would create a crisis in the country and go around opposing the war and hurt Russia's ability to fight Germany in the war. So in 1917, Lenin returned to Russia and from exile from Switzerland with lots of German money and German support, and said, look, I'm here. And he presented his April theses to the Bolsheviks and said, we need to completely change our tactics because there's a really good chance we could take power. We could actually win this thing. We could come to power if we play our cards right. So in April, the Bolsheviks radically changed their tactics, preparing to seize power. And in July, you had the July days where there were strikes demanding an end to Russia's involvement in World War I. The July days, various strikes were happening. And then in September, General Kornilov, who was a general of the Russian military that was fighting World War I, started marching his army back towards St. Petersburg. And the reason he was marching his army back towards St. Petersburg was he wanted to establish a military dictatorship. He wanted to stop the strikes and protests and overthrow the provisional government, establish a military dictatorship. Well, the Bolsheviks teamed up with the provisional government. They dug trenches, they built barbed wire fences, they fortified St. Petersburg, and they were prepared to fight off Kornilov's army. And ultimately, they turned around. They started marching their army back towards the front, and they repelled the Kornilov reaction. And in the process of repelling the Kornilov reaction, the Bolsheviks' army became bigger than the actual regular army of the Russian government. And their militias, the government had opened up the armories and given guns to the Bolshevik militias. And so after the repelling of the Kornilov reaction, the Bolsheviks had a big army, and their Soviets, their councils that they had, their councils of workers and soldiers, deputies were very large. So in September, after they repelled the Kornilov reaction, they decided ultimately we're going to seize power. And they did so. And you had the October Revolution of 1917. And that's how the Bolsheviks took power. And that's where my presentation for tonight ends. But the reason I gave this presentation, and the point of this presentation, is that Marxism is a product of the West, right? And the West is founded on rationalism. Marxism is a form of rationalist philosophy that was intended to correct the shortcomings of the bourgeois revolution and the French Revolution. And out of Marxism's kind of failure, I guess you could say, classical Marxism failed, and it created the crisis of Marxism. What Marx thought was going to happen didn't happen. And out of that failure, a guy in the East, in Russia, developed his own interpretation. And that is what eventually took power in 1917. And that's important to understand, is that Marxism is very much a Western ideology, but it gave birth to a movement that was not a Western movement. That was largely against the Western system. And that is all really, really important to understand. And so that is the first of a series of slideshows I'm doing. That's from Marx to Lenin. And that it's important, if you want to understand what we're doing and you want to understand the world today, you need to understand these big differences, because a lot of people think that we can just go back to what Marx said and we can understand it, or we can just do purely, what the Bolsheviks were doing and we can understand it. And no, you cannot, right? And you have to understand why Lenin was different from Marx. You have to understand that Marxism was a big thing long before Lenin, and it kind of got stale. It kind of, proved itself to be ineffective. And it was out of the crisis of Marxism that we got this new thing called Leninism that led to the Russian Revolution. So that's what I would like you all to understand. And I really, I hope you enjoyed it. There's many more where that came from. So I've got about 6 more of these, I think, 6 more slideshows all the way up to the present day. So names and locations, folks, names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Who is with us? Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations, names and locations. And then we're going to start answering questions, because I know a lot of people sent questions before that weren't answered. So names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations. Bendigo, Australia, David Fox. Michael in Bayonne. Cameroon in New Hampshire. Jacob in Wisconsin. Paul in Brentwood, New York. Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see you. Cameron in New Hampshire. Good to see you all. Ryan in Kansas City. Scott in Pennsylvania. Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see you. Ottawa. Samuel in the Far East. God bless. Well, thank you, Samuel. Doing my best. Doing my best. Chad in Spokane, Washington. Alex in Brazil. Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see you. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? From Finland. Good to see you. Good to see you. Los Angeles. Good to see you as well. Good to see you as well. Good to see you as well, right? We are building an anti-imperialist movement in America. Just a plug, just an announcement here. We are having our 7-day training program in Chicago in August. So if you'd like to get involved in our movement, if you're a CPI member or you're interested in becoming one, I would encourage you to register. We got Gabby in Chicago, Bruce in Canberra, Australia, Ed in Louisville, Mosin in Toronto. So if you'd like to register for our 7-day program in August, it's going to be a really important educational week in Chicago. Register today for the educational, the 7-day program that we're doing in Chicago, building an anti-imperialist movement in America. So register today. You can also become a member of the Center for Political Innovation. That's another good step to take. But yeah, we're having a national training workshop in August. So if you are available for that, please make time. We got a lot of actually exciting projects. There's something coming up this weekend I can't talk too much about. There's something coming up next week that you'll hear about very soon. You know, a lot of great things are happening with CPI. We're always doing stuff. You know, we went out and blocked the No Kings rally. We just had an event at the United Nations, you know, for Women's History Month in March. You know, we're doing great stuff. We're always doing great stuff. So yeah, get involved in what we're doing. Hope you all enjoyed the slideshow. Now, a number of people sent questions that didn't get answered, like over the weekend or previously, and I do apologize for that. So we're going to answer those questions tonight. You know, Gabby sent her questions. You know, other people sent their questions via Buy Me a Coffee. If you want to send more questions, go to buymeacoffee.com and send your questions. It's a great way to support the work that we are doing. It's also a great way to, you know, get your question answered. So I think we'll start with Gabby's questions. We'll start with Gabby's questions, I think. You know, since she sent these questions on Saturday night and we had to shut the stream down early, I think we'll answer Gabby's questions. So Gabby sent two good questions. She said, question number one, trying to understand the bigger picture here. If Trump represents certain power structures, why would there be so much opposition to him? Feels like there are deeper divisions behind the scenes that we're not fully seeing. Because didn't Trump sell out to the imperialists? So why do they still want to get rid of him? Sounds desperate at this point. Well, there are contradictions among the imperialists. Let's remember, for example, Trump seems very close to Netanyahu. And let's remember George Soros was trying to overthrow Netanyahu with the color revolution in Israel, right? And that yes, you know, imperialism seems pretty solidly aligned with Israel, but within Israel, there are different views, right? There's, you know, Netanyahu represents the Likud party and he's facing possible impeachment, right? There's many people in Israel that want to get rid of Netanyahu that have a different approach. Let's remember that the Iran nuclear deal, you know, had a lot of support from the ruling class, but, you know, Trump was opposed to it. Netanyahu came to Congress and gave a speech against it. There are divisions among the imperialists, and ultimately, you know, those differences can play out in different ways. It appears a lot of the people that supported Trump didn't want war, but Trump was so solidly behind the Netanyahu wing of Israeli politics that he is carrying out what they want. And I don't think there's total unity in the ruling class around it. The ruling class supports Israel. The ruling class opposes Iran. But there's a question of how, tactics. And I think there are divisions in the ruling class. And also, I think a lot of the ruling class doesn't appreciate the way Trump is waging this war because it's exposing them. He threatened genocide. He threatened to destroy an entire nation. Right? He didn't think of a pretext. He didn't get Europe on board. That was something the Democrats used to always critique Bush for when his invasion of Iraq. Why didn't you get Europe on board? Right? And that if Obama had gone to war with Iran, he would have gotten all the NATO countries to do it with him. And that a lot of the way Trump is waging his war is to the economic expense of Europe. Right? And Trump is making the world economy scream. This is actually a really good video that Press TV released about the Strait of Hormuz that is closed right now. This is a really big deal, and I mean this little, you know, ocean passage is having really big impact. This is a really powerful video from Press TV about the Strait of Hormuz.
American writer Mark Twain once quipped,
"God created war so that Americans would learn geography."
And in 2026, they seem to be learning it the hard way. So far, they've discovered that 10,900 kilometers from Washington, D.C. lies the world's most critical choke point, a narrow strip of water between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman that stretches 167 kilometers in length, narrows to just 34 kilometers at its tightest point, and carries roughly 30,000 vessels a year. It's called the Strait of Hormuz. Every single normal day, around a fifth of the world's traded oil and LNG flows through this corridor. Most of that oil heads to Asia, but oil prices don't respect geography. They're set globally. So when West Asia sneezes, fuel prices spike everywhere. Oil is only the start. Over 30% of global ammonia trade, nearly half of urea, and 20% of diammonium phosphate, key fertilizer inputs, move through this same choke point, along with about half the world's sulfur for metal processing.
The sulfur didn't arrive, the factory was shut down. It didn't arrive because of the war. and because the Strait of Hormuz was closed.
Unlike oil, these can't be rerouted. There are no pipelines for ammonia or urea. If Hormuz closes, the nitrogen supply chain doesn't slow. It stops. And since synthetic nitrogen fertilizers support roughly 48% of the global population, missing the mid-April application window in the Northern Hemisphere means lower yields by September. It's that simple and that brutal. Major importers like India, Brazil, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and many African countries would quickly face fertilizer shortages, leading to higher food prices, inflation, and a widespread food security crisis affecting billions.
85% of Brazil's fertilizer is imported, and under these conditions, we can only bring part of the land under cultivation.
Meanwhile, about a third of the world's helium, critical for semiconductors and MRIs, passes through the strait. So does nearly 10% of global aluminum and a significant share of Persian Gulf-produced plastics. Even the Persian Gulf states themselves are exposed. This passage is their food lifeline. The biggest one, Saudi Arabia, imports over 80% of its food. The smallest one, Qatar, 85%.
If the strait stays closed for another month or two, the food situation here is going to get really critical.
If anyone thinks the so-called First World would be immune, the reality says otherwise. Since the war began, Brent crude has swung from $73 to nearly $120 at one point, adding about 500 million euros per day in EU energy costs. In late April, the IEA warned Europe may have only 6 weeks of jet fuel left as West Asian imports falter. Prices have surged past $1,500 per ton. The IEA calls this
is the greatest energy crisis in history.
By April 22nd, Lufthansa had canceled 20,000 flights, with more disruptions and price hikes expected. In Germany, the industrial heart of Europe, 78.6% of firms report uncertainty about their future, rising to 87.7% in manufacturing and over 90% in chemicals, rubber, and plastics. The U.S. isn't insulated either. Gas prices jumped more than $1 per gallon in just 6 weeks, surpassing $4.10, the highest level since 2022, while the Hormuz shock fuels inflation.
They said the consumer price index rose 0.9% in March, almost 1% in just 1 month. I haven't seen a jump like that in years.
Meanwhile, a Reuters/Ipsos poll put Trump's approval rating at 36%, its lowest since his return to office. 48 hours into the Iran war, marine insurers began canceling war risk coverage in the Persian Gulf. By March 5th, commercial insurance had effectively vanished. No insurance means no shipping. No shipping means no trade. This isn't a new insight. Back in 1507, Portuguese Admiral Afonso de Albuquerque understood that
whoever controls this choke point controls the flow between India and the Mediterranean.
And by extension, global trade itself. So far, the largest empire in history finds itself with remarkably little to say against one of the oldest. Perhaps this time, the Americans picked the wrong country to learn geography.
Yeah, and I mean, I can imagine there's a lot of people in the ruling class that are losing money because of this, you know. And Trump, the other thing that people have pointed out about this whole crisis is that Trump knows what's going to happen before he does it, before he announces it on Twitter. And all of Trump's friends and buddies can go buy stocks and bet on it, and that there's a huge amount of insider trading going on. And that's what Marjorie Taylor Greene pointed out. You know, the strait is closed, the strait is open. There's insider trading, and there's people making lots of money on this, but largely the world economy is screaming. You know, I mean, this is a mess. And so a lot of capitalists are losing out on this. Trump and his friends are making lots of money betting and insider trading on what's going to happen, trying to get the military budget increased. Trump is desperately trying to get the military budget up by 50% to be $1.5 trillion. So there are big divisions in the ruling class, and there's a lot of people that this is to their economic benefit. And there's a lot of people that are really losing out with these high oil prices and everything. So that's what we need to understand, is that there are contradictions among the imperialists. The question is, how can we maneuver among those contradictions to get something good, to win justice for ourselves, right? And that's the point. Now, the second question from Gabby is, she said, are we at strategic equilibrium? And the next one is strategic offensive. But people aren't picking sides. We are not. I will just say that we are nowhere near that. We're still in strategic defensive. The way a revolutionary movement generally operates, this is according to Frank Kitson, Frank Kitson, the counterinsurgency strategist. He talked about subversion, terrorism, civil war, and Mao Zedong talked about strategic defensive, strategic equilibrium, strategic offensive. That basically, in terms of revolutionary movements, there is a time where they have very little influence. And that's the time we're in now. I mean, we don't have that much influence. I mean, a lot of people are angry at the system. There's widespread, Frank Kitson would call it subversion. There's widespread anger at the status quo, anger at the system. But other than that, we don't have a real movement of any kind, right? So we're in strategic defensive. Then you enter a period called strategic equilibrium. And that is where the divisions within the ruling class are intense enough and the crisis in society is intense enough that a revolutionary movement can emerge and exercise power and have real influence. And we have not had anything approaching strategic equilibrium in America since the 1930s. It looked like maybe we might be headed into strategic equilibrium in the early 1970s, but it didn't happen. There was never really a mass movement that had a base among the population solidly enough. You could argue maybe among the Black community with the Black Panthers a little bit, but not even really there. It was quickly cut off, right? We don't have strategic equilibrium. Then strategic equilibrium, as a result of strategic equilibrium, it gets to the point that a question solidly divides society, and the revolutionary movement makes up the bulk of one side of the question. And through that is able to take power on the basis of being on one side of the question. And that's strategic offensive. And, strategic offensive, most of the time we've seen revolutions happen. It's because, there's a Nazi invasion or society is going to, fascism, and the communists represent the anti-fascist side. In the Russian Revolution, the division was World War I, and society was heavily divided over World War I, and the Bolsheviks were the ones that were opposed to World War I, and they had strategic equilibrium, and ultimately, when society became really, really polarized over the question of World War I, they took power as the anti-war force. We're not in strategic equilibrium. We're not in strategic defensive. We're in strategic defensive. Right now, we have ideas. We exist, and we are an isolated layer of people, but we don't have bulk of the population. The crisis has not become intensified enough, but also we just don't have enough of a network. Even if the crisis did become intense enough, we wouldn't have enough of a network to really build anything and capitalize off of such a crisis. So we're in strategic defensive at this point. And I've given other slideshows about this, but yeah, generally, we need to prepare for a strategic equilibrium. Strategic equilibrium could come at any time. We're not there. And largely the ruling class knows this. And that's why they're doing everything they can to weaken revolutionary movements. That's why they targeted the Uhuru movement, is because they are the only anti-imperialist force in America that has a base among the population, that if we entered strategic equilibrium, they could actually expand. All right. I mean, in terms of what they've got in St. Louis and in Florida, they've got a base among the population. They provide services. They actually are prepared that when the crisis were to intensify into strategic equilibrium, they could actually become a major force in society. No other anti-imperialist force has that. So, that's why the U.S. government went after them. They've read Frank Kitson. They've read William S. Lynn. They know what they're doing in terms of counterinsurgency. And that the Uhuru movement, they represent an anti-imperialist force that is positioned to lead a section of the population as the crisis intensifies if strategic equilibrium were to hit. CPI certainly doesn't have a base among the population yet. I'd like us to have more influence, but right now we're just people talking about ideas. So, there you go. I hope that was helpful. So now we're going to do the coffees, and that there's been a lot of them that have come in. Right. I think I answered Richard's question about white men. I answered that one already. So then John McCarthy said, one of the latest Lego videos is "We love Americans, but not your government." And this is an Iranian Lego video about "We love Americans, but not the government." And I will put this on. It's a little long, I will say, John. I started watching it the other day. It's a little bit long, but you know, why not put it on? Okay, so this is the Iranian Lego video called you know, and it's important because there's a lot of, well, we'll talk about it afterwards, but this video is very, very important. I would argue. It's very important because these are the Iranians, right? They're at war with America right now, right? I mean, that they've been bombed and attacked by America, and they're not, you know, this is their approach that they're taking, and that one thing that I think there is way too much of among people that are intellectually intrigued by anti-imperialism is performative anti-Americanism. It's not helpful, right? Sending a message of hostility to the American people is not helpful, and that there's a huge amount of it, and it's childish and it's juvenile. And look, these are the Iranians. This is what the Iranian forces, right? This is the legendary Lego videos of the Iranians. This is one of them, and it's not F you guys, you're all racist Euro settlers. No, this is what they said.
We do not hate you, people of the West. We see you through the smoke of what they call progress. We have watched from across the ocean, from behind their walls, and what we see is a people who deserve better than what rules them. This is not a war cry. This is a wake-up call. Open your eyes, brothers and sisters. The hands that wave your flag are not the hands that hold you. Listen.
We love Americans. We love your soul.
The land of dreamers,
The brave, the bold.
but something sits on top of you,
Dressed in your name,
spending your children's blood
like a game. We love Americans.
Oh yes we do.
But the ones who speak for you don't speak for you.
Wake up,
Before the morning's gone.
they built the cage so slow. You thought it was your home, yeah, they hand you left and right like two halves of a lie. Different faces, different voices, same agenda inside. One wears a blue suit, one wears a red tie, but behind closed doors they shake hands and divide. The taxes from your table fund the war you never chose. They name it liberation, but it's oil, everyone knows. They call us terrorists on the television screen, while the real terrorism wears a suit and gets a pension in a dream. They sell your children futures built on manufactured debt. Then send those very children off the wars they'll soon forget. And when the coffins come home draped in stars and stripes, nobody on that podium is losing sleep at night. The media machine spins before the body hits the ground. A new enemy is needed every time the polls come down. We watched it from Tehran, from Kabul, from Baghdad too. The ones they demonize were people just like you. They said we hate your freedom, but your freedom is our dream. We read your constitution, we know what those words mean. It's the ones who wrote the speeches and then buried what they said, who turned that sacred document into a tool of dread.
We love Americans. We love your soul.
The land of dreamers,
The brave, the bold.
but something sits on top of you.
Dressed in your name, spending your children's blood like a game. We love Americans. Oh yes we do. But the ones who speak for you don't speak for you.
Wake up,
Before the morning's gone.
they built the cage so slow. You thought it was your home, the billionaire who funds the law and writes the law himself. The pharmaceutical machine that keeps you sick for profit and for wealth. The school that teaches history with chapters torn away, so you never ask the question, who really made it this way? They gave you social media so you argue with your neighbor while they sign the deals in secret, taking everything you labored. Left versus right, black versus white, they need you divided. Because a united people's the only thing they've ever dreaded. They sanctioned us, they bombed us, they painted us as beasts, but the ordinary American was never at that feast. You were working double shifts while they were working diplomats. You were counting grocery bills while they were counting combat stats. We don't confuse the empire with the people that it rules. History is full of kings who turned their own into their tools. Your founding fathers warned you, yes. They wrote it clear. That power concentrated is the thing that you should fear. That foreign wars and secret deals and banks too big to name, where the very seeds of tyranny dressed up in freedom's frame. And now we watch across the sea and wonder, do they know? Do the people of that nation see the curtain in the show? We've lost our brothers, lost our sisters, lost our skies to their machines. But we separate the people from the politics and schemes, because hatred is their weapon, love is ours to wield, and truth is the only armor that will never crack or yield. So we sing this not in anger but in solidarity, that the people of the world want nothing more than to be free from the ones who take our names and use them for their wars. We are not your enemies, we're prisoners of the same cause. We love Americans, we love your soul. The land of dreamers, the brave, the bold. But something sits on top of you, dressed in your name, spending your children's blood like a game. We love Americans, oh yes we do. But the ones who speak for you don't speak for you. Wake up, before the morning's gone. They built the cage so slow.
You thought it was your home. We do not celebrate your suffering, we mourn it the same way we mourn our own. Because your mother crying for a soldier is no different from my mother crying in the rubble. Pain does not have a passport, and the ones who cause it never feel it. So to every American reading a headline and feeling confused, to every citizen wondering why everything feels rigged,
You are not crazy,
you are not alone.
and from the other side of the wall they built between us,
We see you,
we hear you,
and we are standing here,
not as your enemy,
but as proof
that the world
that the world. We do not hate you, people of the West. We see you through the smoke of what they call progress. We have watched from across the ocean, from behind their walls, and what we see is a people who deserve better than what rules them. This is not a war cry, this is a wake-up call. Open your eyes, brothers and sisters. The hands that wave your flag are not the hands that hold you. Listen.
We love Americans, we love your soul. The land of dreamers, the brave, the bold. But something sits on top of you, dressed in your name, spinning your children's blood like a game. We love Americans, oh yes we do. But the ones who speak for you don't speak for you. Wake up, before the morning's gone.
They built the cage so slow you thought it was.
They had you left and right, like two halves of a lot. Different faces, different voices, same agenda inside. One wears a blue suit, one wears a red tie. But behind closed doors, they shake hands and divide. The taxes from your table fund a war you never chose. They name it liberation, but it's all everyone knows. They call us terrorists on the television screen, while the real terrorism wears a suit and gets a pension and a dream. They sell your children futures built on manufactured debt, then send those very children off the wars they'll soon forget. And when the coffins come home draped in stars and stripes, nobody on that podium is losing sleep at night. The media machine spins before the body hits the ground, and new enemies needed every time the polls come down. We watched it from Tehran, from Kabul, from Baghdad to the ones they demonize. We're people just like you. They said we hate your freedom, but your freedom is our dream. We've read your constitution, we know what those words mean. It's the ones who wrote the speeches and then buried what they said, who turned that sacred document into a tool of dread. Americans, we love your soul. The land of dreamers, the brave, the bold. But something sits on top of you, dressed in your name, spinning your children's blood like a game. Americans, oh yes we do. But the ones who speak for you don't speak for you. Wake up, before the morning's gone.
They built the cage so slow you thought it was your home.
The billionaire who funds the law then writes the law himself. The pharmaceutical machine that keeps you sick for profit and for wealth. The school that teaches history with chapters torn away, so you never ask the question, who really made it this way? They gave you social media so you'd argue with your neighbor while they sign the deals in secret, taking everything you labored. Left versus right, black versus white. They need you divided because a united people is the only thing they've ever dreaded. They sanctioned us, they bombed us, they painted us as beasts, but the ordinary American was was never at that feast. You were working double shifts while they were working diplomats. You were counting grocery bills while they were counting combat stats. We don't confuse the empire with the people that it rules. History is full of kings who turn their own into their tools. Your founding fathers warned you, yes, they wrote it clear. That power concentrated is the thing that you should fear. That foreign wars and secret deals and banks too big to name were the very seeds of tyranny dressed up in freedom's frame. And now we watch across the sea and wonder, do they know? Do the people of that nation see the curtain and the show? We've lost our brothers, lost our sisters, lost our skies to their machines. But we separate the people from the politics and schemes, because hatred is their weapon, love is ours to wield, and truth is the only armor that will never crack or yield. So we sing this not in anger but in solidarity, that the people of the world want nothing more than to be free from the ones who take our names and use them for their wars. We are not your enemies, we're prisoners of the same. We love Americans, we love your soul. The land of dreamers, the brave, the bold. But something sits on top of you, dressed in your name, spilling your children's blood like a game. Americans, oh yes we do. But the ones who speak for you don't speak for you. Wake up before the morning's gone.
They built the cage so slow you thought it was your home. We do not celebrate your suffering, we mourn it the same way we mourn our own. Because your mother crying for a soldier is no different from my mother crying in the rubble. Pain does not have a passport, and the ones who cause it never feel it. So to every American reading a headline and feeling confused, to every citizen wondering why everything feels rigged, you are not crazy. You are not alone. And from the other side of the wall they built between us,
We see you,
we hear you,
and we are
standing here,
not as your enemy,
not as your enemy,
but as proof
that the world, at the world.
Wow. Well, like I said, it was long, 10 minutes, but you know, it was worth it. That was great. That was absolutely great. And I did see that Paul sent a coffee, but it was blank. Did you mean to send a question, Paul? If you want to follow up with a question, if you forgot to put the question in, just let me know. If not, if it was just a donation, that's fine. But you know, we got a couple more coffees to answer. And if anyone else has any more questions, best way to do it is go to Buy Me a Coffee. Send me a question via Buy Me a Coffee. You can also Cash App me at Caleb Maupin 22 on Cash App, or you can send a Rumble rant. I see there's a couple of those. We'll do those first. But yeah, so we'll do the other coffees. So this is an interesting one. Why didn't the USA adopt the Westminster system of government, where you have an opposition leader hold Trump accountable? Well, we don't have a parliamentary system in America, right? We have a federal or presidential system, where we have three branches of government, right? In the parliamentary British system, you have one branch of government, which is the parliament, and the ruling party kind of takes all. Whereas the way it is in America is you have the executive branch, which is the president. You have the legislative branch, which is the two houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And then you have the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. So we have a completely different system here in terms of election. And look, I am the first to tell you that, in terms of democracy, right? The USA goes around the world attacking countries on the basis of democracy. There are a lot of things about our system that are not democratic. Right. And this is, when I go to Russia, right, Russia's elections are more democratic than America's are. And you hear that and you say, that's crazy, Caleb. How is that? I'll tell you. Right. In America, if you live in Guam, you have zero say in who the president is. You live in Puerto Rico, zero say in who the president is. You live in the Virgin Islands, you have no say. There are whole chunks of America that have absolutely zero say in who is the president, because they're not states, they're territories. Now, could you imagine if there was a big chunk of Russia that didn't get to vote in the election, we would call that dictatorship. There was a big chunk of Russia. If one of the Russian republics got no say, we would call that dictatorship. But in Russia, every corner, every inch of Russia, no matter where you live in Russia, if you're a Russian citizen, you get to vote. That is more democratic. Also, Russians, every vote counts in terms of who gets to be the president. In America, we have this thing called the Electoral College. And so I live in New York. And, you know, if I had gone and voted for Trump, not telling you how I voted, it wouldn't have fucking mattered because New York City is a Democrat state. And if I were a Kamala Harris supporter and I lived in Alabama, I could go and vote for Kamala Harris and it wouldn't fucking matter because all of Alabama's votes would go to Trump. And your vote, you don't actually get to vote for the president. Your state gets to vote. And other than like one of the states that divides its electoral votes, all of the states, for the most part, except there's one state that actually divides its votes, but all the states pretty much give all their votes to one candidate. Another thing about the U.S. elections. In Russia, the elections are a national holiday. The country shuts down for a long weekend so that everybody has a chance to go and vote. In America, we have our elections on a work day, and it's a Tuesday, and there are big lines before work to go vote, big lines after work to go and vote, and most people have a full work day on the election. They don't want participation. Another thing, in Russia, if you're serving a prison sentence, in the jail, they have a voting booth. In America, not only do they not have a voting booth in the jail, but in most states, if you go to jail, you lose your right to vote for your entire life. Now, they're changing that in some states, but in a lot of states, if you have ever been convicted of a felony, you can't ever vote again for the rest of your life. In Russia, they have voting booths in the jail so that prisoners can vote. They have voting booths in the hospitals so that people that are getting medical treatment and can't get out to go to the polling place can vote in the jail. So, if you want to tell me that we're like the ideal example of democracy, we are not that. Right? By basic standards, our democracy isn't very democratic, right? Does that mean that there aren't problems in Russia? Of course not. Does that mean that there aren't problems in other countries? No. But I'm just telling you that we constantly go around, lecturing countries about democracy when we don't even have a national holiday for our elections, when big chunks of our country get no say, when we have this electoral college system that, basically cancels out your vote if you're in a state where people don't agree with you. There's plenty to criticize, about the way our electoral system is held. So yeah, we don't have, we can't do a vote of no confidence, and we just don't have that kind of system. We have scheduled elections, right? And yeah, I mean, that's the way we do these things. Next question is, someone said, it seems like Dulce Rodriguez condemned the assassination attempt on Trump. Well, that's the right thing to do. We don't advocate presidential assassination attempts. So first of all, I think, and also you remember Maduro condemned the presidential assassination against Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. So that in and of itself, that is just the honest thing to do. If you are the internationally recognized head of state of any country, you should condemn the assassination of the leader of any country, including the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, right? That was unacceptable. And the kidnapping of Maduro, it's unacceptable, right? And that she did the right thing. She took the high ground, right? I mean, that is another thing. But then you're also talking about, they're saying she's a traitor. She joined the IMF. Well, look, I was in Russia recently and I spoke to Venezuelans and I've talked to other people and, it's mucho complexo, as they said, right? There's a whole wave of people on the internet that are saying Dulce Rodriguez is a big traitor. Well, again, the USA has an indictment against her. They could kidnap her at any time. She's got a gun to her head. She's trying to avoid a civil war in Venezuela. And the economic foundations of the Bolivarian Revolution are well intact. The communes are well intact. They have not been privatizing things. If there were to be a full counter-revolution in Venezuela, we would know about it. That's the changing of property, changes hands, and counter-revolutions, you can't blink and miss them. It's not like somebody from the top just had a bad political line. If Dulce were to actually be moving ahead to try and dismantle and reverse the Bolivarian Revolution, a big chunk of the country would fight against her and you would have a civil war in Venezuela. I don't think that's what's happening. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but it doesn't appear to be that simple. The other thing, though, is that, the idea that she's doing everything the right way. Basically what the Venezuelans that I've spoken to have told me is it's very complicated. It's not that simple. She's acting under duress. Venezuela is trying to not have a civil war. Venezuela is their ability to export oil, and I mean they're under threat and occupation. They're making deals with the United States, restoring diplomatic relations, etc. And it's complicated, is what I'm being told. That yes, the counter-revolution in Venezuela still exists, and that there are forces that would like to see this as an opportunity to overturn the revolution. There are also forces in Venezuela that are trying to do the best they can. There are people in Venezuela who think negatively of Delcy Rodriguez, but the general feeling is that she's on the right side, but she's making very tough decisions, but it's complicated. And that's kind of how it is. And also what was pointed out by Craig Murray, who is a writer who is on the ground, is he said a lot of what Venezuela is doing right now really depends on the short term and how things play out in the short term. Because things in the world and on the international oil markets especially are really in flux right now. So they're making short-term decisions to try to do the best thing in the moment based on the fact the world could change at any time. So I think that all of that is a fair point to make. And that, look, I will say many times, we need to stop advocating against our own side. If there's a counter-revolution in Venezuela, we will all know. All right. Venezuela, is it clear that they're doing things that don't seem right? Yes. Is it clear that they've had their sovereignty thoroughly violated by Maduro being kidnapped? Yes. Is it clear that their ability to export oil and they're being bullied by the United States? At the same time, the United States is starting to also give them investment and establish diplomatic relations and lift sanctions. It's a mess. It's a messy situation. If there is a counter-revolution, we will know. And I know for a fact that there is a big section of the population there in Venezuela that won't go down. They won't go down without a fight. So if it becomes to a full counter-revolution, there will be an uprising in Venezuela, and a big section of the military, probably the overwhelming majority of the military and a big section of the population, won't let a counter-revolution pass. So it's not that simple. It's a messy situation. And it's possible, yes, that bad decisions are being made amid that messy situation. That's possible. I'm not saying that Delcy is necessarily doing everything right. And that's what the Venezuelans I spoke to said. It's not that simple. But, is it a full counter-revolution? Not at this time. And if it is, we'll know. And, they're, I'm sure, doing everything they can to prevent that. But are they doing the right things to prevent that? That's not necessarily agreed on, but yeah, we don't know what she's doing behind closed doors. And ultimately, counter-revolutions are not something you can blink and miss. And this is a really big problem with communism as a movement. And I'll just say that I'm not a communist. I'm an innovationist, right? And that communism as a movement is bankrupt. And part of it is, in 1956 or in, I guess, 1961, Mao declared there was a counter-revolution in the Soviet Union and nobody noticed. Right. And that this idea that a country can go from being a revolutionary anti-imperialist country to being fake socialists and just a tool of the imperialists, and just because they have the wrong political line. That is one of the stupidest things. Right. And it's from the Gang of Four in China. Right. Not Deng Xiaoping, but before Deng Xiaoping, Mao's wife, and this notion of, if a leader espouses the wrong political line, then the society is not truly moving towards communism and it's not liberating. That's bullshit, right? And it's this idealist subjective crap that, Bob Avakian espouses a bunch of that. Enver Hoxha of Albania espoused that. And it's a bunch of crap. And yeah, if you think the Soviet Union restored capitalism in 1956 because Khrushchev gave a speech, yeah, I can understand why you might think, oh, Delcy did the wrong thing, so Venezuela's revolution's over. Yeah, I mean, that would make sense. That's that's called idealism, right? Or people that say that, oh, the Soviet Union, because Stalin, did trade deals with Nazi Germany or whatever, it wasn't really revolutionary. It wasn't the permanent revolution of Trotsky. This like left sectarian line that is like, that my feelings define reality, right? that capitalism and the imperialist capitalist system is defined by profits in command. There are clearly countries in this world where profits are not in command. Venezuela is one of those countries. Iran is one of those countries. China is one of those countries. And if the leader of one of those countries does the wrong thing or does the right thing under very bad circumstances, does that country then stop being a country where profits are not in command? No. Right? And that this is subjective, liberal, idealist thinking. You know, and I mean, look, I really, if it was up, I'm at the point where I do not agree with Karl Marx's philosophy. I believe in God. I am not a materialist. I'm definitely an idealist. I believe in the power of the human will. I believe in the power of God and the power of human ideas. You know, and I would say that Marx's philosophy is very wrong. His economics is right on. But it was updated by Lenin. Lenin understood it even more, and that there's been further developments. And that, you know, Marx's economic theories had pointed to a lot of truth, right? You know, I just want to say that the communist movement that is loyal to that aesthetic and is loyal to that spirit of rebellion and the red flag and has kind of forgotten about Marxist economics has completely lost its way. Look, I am really the innovationist turn that CPI took, where we decided to stop calling ourselves communists. That was really important, because as long as you are begging for a place in communism in America, you are begging for a seat at a table covered in shit. Right? That's basically what you do. If you call yourself a communist in America, you are begging for a seat at a table that is covered in shit. I'm not going to beg for a seat at a table covered in shit. American communism is covered in shit. It's covered in utter shit. The Communist Party USA, the Trotskyite groups, it's a bad scene. They're going nowhere, and they're all fighting with each other over who gets the franchise of a dead brand. And if you continue to identify with communism, even if you try not to, we said out of the movement to the masses, but to really do what we wanted to do and go lower and deeper to the real masses, we had to just say, we're done with the communism thing. We're doing something different. Anti-imperialism in our time is different. And we draw from Wallace Wattles. We draw from you know, geopolitical thinking, Atlanticism versus Eurasianism. You know, I take a lot of inspiration from a lot of the breakthroughs of Lynn Marcus. I take a lot from Wallace Wattles. I take a lot from Dugan and geopolitical thought. And that, look, we're in a different time, right? We're an eclectic brand. And yes, Marxism in a lot of ways laid the foundation for our anti-imperialist understanding, but largely the anti-imperialist world, as the whole first hour and a half presentation I was pointing out, it's not what Marx said. It's an Eastern thing. Marx was a form of Western philosophy that, you know, and what I'm trying to get you to understand is we're doing our own thing. We're building a new movement, and we give off a different vibe. Communists are the most negative, vengeful, resentful. You know, we give off a totally different vibe. And, you know, and that, you know, we cannot be begging for a seat at a table covered in shit. You know, I want to get a table that's not covered in shit, you know, and I'm not going to, you know, and that if you call yourself a communist, that puts you into competition with all the other communists for who gets to own communism. And owning communism is owning a table. It's a seat at a table covered in shit. It's not in America. And around the world, it's different, right? Around the world, being a communist is a very different thing. But in America and in the West, communism is a completely dead brand. It's completely tainted. And you know, if you claim it as your name, as your ideology, you end up fighting with a lot of other people that are very toxic and competing with them, and it's just not productive, right? And look, and I wrote to the Marxists, and I know that Tyler out in Missouri is working on a review of it. I can't wait to hear what he says, and he may disagree with me, and that's okay. People are allowed to disagree with me. You know, that was one of my biggest pet peeves about the Bob Avakian people, I will say. When I was around them, they complained at me, why don't you ever write any reviews of you know, our stuff? of Bob Avakian's work. And I remember I said to them, because every time I talk about anything you guys do, you get mad that I talked about it wrong. And you know, it's like you won't accept me actually engaging with it. If I were to actually engage with anything Bob Avakian wrote and were to say it's wrong and point that out, you'd lose your minds. And if I even wrote about it in a positive way, but I said something wrong, I said something, I misrepresented a point, you would lose your minds. So like, no, it's not safe to engage with your material. And they were very offended by it, but it was true, right? That they didn't want people to engage with their stuff. I want people to engage with my stuff. Now, I don't appreciate the kinds of childish attacks that my work, you know, that's why I don't do ebooks, right? It's because people download the ebooks and then they just quote mine so they can go, aha, he's a Nazi. And I don't appreciate like bread tube style where they like read my book and, you know, out loud, and it's like every sentence, oh, he must be retarded. You know, I don't like that. But if you actually read what I'm writing, you read what I'm saying, and you have a critique, or you think I'm right on some points, I'm wrong on some points, I appreciate that, you know, and I work to develop a thicker skin about these things. I really do. You know, engagement is a good thing, right? You can get engaged with my content. This a couple people, like there's one guy who's working on a review of the Mystical Stalinism book. I guess he's a guy of Roman Catholic faith who lives in Britain and is also an admirer of Stalin, and he's writing a review of that. I can't wait to see what he does with that. You know, Tyler out in Missouri is working on a review of my To the Marxists letter about the innovationist turn. Good for him. You know, engagement is good, and not everyone's going to agree with everything ever. You know, that's just not how the world works. You know, but we just have to keep building our movement. But yeah, that not being communist is important, because, you know, the dialectical materialist philosophy leads to a negative place, and communism, it's got that red flag, vengeance, jealousy, resentment. I mean, and communists have largely internalized anti-communism. I mean, I spent my whole life as a communist trying to explain to people means of production, tendency of the falling rate of profit. Well, what was I doing? Now there's a whole bunch of 20-year-olds out there all over social media speaking in the name of communism who just do exactly the stereotype that you know, just fit exactly. You know, I was told when I was in school, communists want everyone to be paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. I spent a whole lot of time explaining to people, no, communists want central control of the means of production. And then these kids come along, I want everyone to get paid. Yeah, why should you get paid more? And I'm just like, oh God, they just are the caricature. They've internalized the anti-communist narrative. They just act it out to like get revenge on their parents or whatever. It's juvenile, and look, a lot of politics in our time is just, I mean, it's a mess. And look, we got to build something. We got to build a real movement. And everything I do is dedicated to building a movement. I'm not interested in just winning an internet debate. I'm not interested in winning the internet and getting the most views. I'm interested in building a movement. So in order to build a movement, I need to break with a movement that already exists, that is dead, that is toxic, that is tainted, that is a mess. It is a complete mess. We're building the Center for Political Innovation, and we're doing a great job. We're doing a great job. You know, so I think we're doing great with CPI. Dare to struggle, dare to win. So yeah, I could swear there was another question somebody had sent in. Huh, that's odd. I could swear there was another. Right? Did I skip? Yeah, someone said, okay, this was one. They said, were Jews involved in the slave trade disproportionately? What about Jews in the civil rights movement? You talked about a split in the civil rights movement over Palestine. Look, you got to be careful with that. Okay. And I see, I'm not even going to read the next line of the question that somebody sent in. All right. You got to be careful with this. Okay. I can guarantee you one thing that did not happen, right, is that during the time of slavery, there were these, you know, maniacal evil Jews that sat there and said, "Mwahaha, we shall do this evil thing called slavery. Mwahaha, and then we shall write the history so that no one knows we did it, and it's the white people that are blamed for it." Like, do you really believe that? Are you that stupid? Were there Jewish people involved in the slave trade? I'm sure there were at some point. I mean, but is slavery to be blamed on one ethnic group? No. I mean, slavery was an abomination, and it was largely done by white people to black people, the transatlantic slave trade at least. Were some of the white people involved in it Jewish? Yes. Were some who were involved in it not Jewish? Yes. My understanding is that the slave owning class of the South, of the US South, was largely Scottish, kind of Scottish capitalists, right? Who'd been kind of displaced, and that there was a lot of like Scottish influence, and that Anglo, slave owners in the South, but, were there Jewish people among them? Yeah, I believe there were some high-ranking Confederate officials that were of Jewish descent, and the Nation of Islam has written about this, and that, look, you got to be careful with all of this. You really got to be careful with all of this, and that, I will say that, how do I want to put this? I mean, look, I'm not an expert on this topic. I'm really not, because I don't consider it important. I really don't like writing history by pointing fingers at ethnic groups. It's not helpful. And that, I mean, to be fair, there is a lot of woke stuff that is like that. Right? If you read a lot of woke material, it just says the problem in human history is white people. Well, that's not the problem. The problem is economic systems that largely started in places that white people existed. The first victims of that were largely white people. I mean, the enclosure movement, right? The peasants who got cleared off their land. Read about primitive accumulation. A lot of white people got killed, as capitalism was emerging and moving towards the stage of colonialism. I mean, there were a lot of white victims of it. Right? I mean, there's a narrative where white people are the problem. It's not white people. It's economic systems that are the problem. It's modes of production, and yes, white people have sat at the center of them, and white people have largely benefited from it too. There's no question about that. So it's complicated, but you shouldn't be looking at world history from the guise of let's find an ethnic group to blame. That's generally not a good way to look at world history from any perspective, whether you're blaming Jews, whether you're blaming white people, whether you're blaming any other group, right? That largely, and if you think the problem is just some ethnic group, you're not going to come up with solutions. And, and what about, what about Irish people? I mean, they were victims of colonialism, still are. Are they white? I mean, I mean, it's complicated. And yeah, I don't know. I saw that, and, I've ranted on these live streams a lot about crypto Zionism. And then this person talked about the Nation of Islam and how they reached out to different forces in America. And that's all true. And that's complicated. And it's all true. And there's complex history that I'm not going to get into tonight. And none of that, you're not wrong in pointing out that these debates existed. You're not. I mean, Marcus Garvey called out, he felt that Zionists were manipulating the black struggle, and that Zionists had framed him up, and that's why he was sent to prison. And, there is, and the split in the civil rights movement over Palestine, and the way a lot of, civil rights activists, supported Israel because their donors were people that supported Israel. And, there's a complex history there. Right. And that I've ranted about that on many live streams, but look, I'll just be serious. Anti-Semitism, like not questioning Israel, not even calling out crypto Zionism like I do. Actual anti-Semitism is dumb. All right. It is brain damaged. Okay. And I'm sorry, but get on the internet. Look, there's loads of anti-Semitism on the internet. Actual anti-Semites are dumb. They are very, very, very dumb. It is caveman ideology. Him race, have more money. Me race, kill him and get him money. It is caveman dumb shit, right? David Duke. Go read any David Duke book, right? David Duke is the king of American anti-Semitism. Every David Duke book starts out with communism killed a gamillion people, and everything you've ever been told about Stalin and Mao and Fidel Castro, it's all true. And CNN tells the truth about every communist government. And communism was invented by the Jews. And that right there tells, where did David Duke get his PhD? Why is he Dr. David Duke? He got it in Ukraine. Because there's a lot of other people in Ukraine that share his perspective on World War II, in case you didn't notice. So, yeah, no, seriously, like literally, show me one anti-Semitic book written by an American, right? Maybe there's an anti-Semite in some other part of the world who doesn't talk this way. But show me one anti-Semitic book by an American that does not begin with everything you ever heard about communism is true. All the lies justified the Vietnam War. All the lies about Stalin. It's all true. Communism is the most evil thing. And communists are Jews. I mean, there's a level of dumb there, right? That it's just like, that's anti-Semitism, right? And it's just, we're going to appeal to the most, Cold War, David Duquesne. I mean, we're talking about actual anti-Semitism here, not people that question Israel, not people that question Zionist manipulation of the civil rights movement, not the Nation of Islam that has we're talking about like blatant people that think the problem is just one ethnic group. It's a really, really dumb view. I mean, there's, it was called the socialism of fools. And that while we can talk about Zionism, we can talk about crypto Zionism. You can read my work on Trotsky and the spirit of the ghetto and all that, but we're talking like blatant, full on anti-Semitism is, go and read it for yourself. They're idiots. They are fucking idiots. It is a worldview for idiots. It is a worldview for bigoted, ignorant fools. Right. And that, we walk a fine line here because it's complicated, right? And that there are, there's all kinds of rules that have been made, but you can't talk about this, or you're anti-Semitic, you can't talk about that. I don't play by those rules, right? And I am the first to call out the crypto Zionism, and I even don't appreciate Norman Finkelstein. I like his work about Israel and stuff, but then when he starts on this tirade about, oh, Israel's an innocent victim, it's evil America is manipulating Israel, and I mean, I'm offended by that. I view that as a soft Zionist position. He's covering up for Israel. He's bigoted, right? And I view that view is, they ultimately, what they're saying, these forces that are just bending over backwards now, no, Israel was forced by America, right? I view that as racism. What they're saying is my people, usually they're of Jewish descent, my people couldn't be responsible for these crimes. And they want to blame white Americans, non-Jewish white Americans. It has to be non-Jewish white Americans that are to blame for this. That's what they're saying. And, I don't blame average working class Jewish people for what Netanyahu does, but I also don't blame average working class Americans for what the American government does, but they do. And I'm offended by it. And having been around these kind of crypto Zionists for a long time, I take offense at that. So, I'm generally somebody who I have spent a long time, walking on eggshells around that topic. I don't anymore. But at the same time, I know what actual anti-Semitism, which is low IQ. Actual anti-Semitism is low IQ stuff. Okay. It is, right? There's just no way around it. When you encounter like straight up verbatim people that just say the problem is them Jews, they ain't smart. Okay. They ain't smart. And that's just, don't be Borat, please don't be Borat. The Zionists, Borat is a Zionist propaganda film, and Borat is a caricature of an anti-Semite, right? It's like a combination between, like a Middle Eastern or Muslim person and a Russian, and he walks around saying stupidly anti-Semitic things. And then he comes to America and he like sets up a lot of situations to draw Americans out and show them that they're also, don't do that, right? We're not anti-Semites, right? But we don't beat around the bush, and we'll talk about different topics. I'm not opposed to exploring topics that Zionists tell us are forbidden. I'm not opposed to stepping on toes. I'm not opposed to calling out so-called, the PSL line, that Israel is the innocent. I'll call that out. That's a crypto Zionist line. However, anyway, I made the point. So I made the point. Did I miss any other Buy Me a Coffees? Did I miss any other ones? I answered Gabby's questions. Okay, well, let me do the did you see the new Comintern revival called Sovintern? No, I did not. And I almost don't want to know. And that, I mean, that looks like an anti-Rush. What is that? Sovintern? Okay. Okay, so this is, all right. No, didn't see it. And yeah, I mean, we're not doing the communism thing. So Sovintern. Okay. Yeah, not interested. So, you know, and not interested, in the forces that are involved are not serious forces. So, you know, I mean, that looks unfortunate to me. But yeah, no, anything that certain people that are listed there is involved in is not serious, right? And if you've been around those people, you would know that. So, you know, I'm sure it makes a lot of great internet social media activity. That's not a real thing. So, you know, I just Googled this. Yeah, it's not a real thing. So yeah, just look at who's involved. It's not a real thing. So yeah, I don't know what more to say about it. You know, it's not a real thing. If those people are involved, it's not a real thing. Anyhow, so what else? Okay, Western civilization. Dr. Saud al-Azwai wrote Harvard's webpage, the assassination of 250 Iraqi scientists after Iraq's invasion by Occupy militias is the best way to not continue depleted uranium research. Well, there's that whole story about the scientists that are disappearing now, right? That's what I covered. The NASA whistleblowers. Yeah, you're asking about that story, which is, look, that's a very big story, and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know why these scientists are disappearing. You know, I don't know what's going on with these NASA people that are disappearing and all that. That's pretty weird. No, I didn't miss it. I saw it. You know, I don't know what to make of it, right? I don't know what to make of it. Yeah, that's a disturbing story for sure. So, yeah. And I mean, yeah, I don't know what more to say. So, yeah. There you go. Are we done? I think we're done, right? I answered all the questions that people sent, unless anyone sent any more questions. I could swear there were more Buy Me a Coffees, but maybe there weren't. There was that one that I dug up that was like I missed. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that's it. I think the PowerPoint tonight went pretty well. You know, so yeah, we got like put music. Okay. All right. I'll put music. I will follow Gabby's suggestion. I will put music and give people the opportunity to send any last questions they have. And then we're done. All right. Gabby is full of great suggestions. When Gabby says to do something, I do it. So there we go. Right. All right. What music should I put on? Oh, here's a song. This is The Road. This is a live performance of a song from the 80s by White Lion. It was called The Road to Valhalla. So let's put that on.
There is a road that leads to Valhalla, but only the chosen are allowed. There is a boy with a dream of Valhalla, a place in the light of the gods. In the hall where the fire burns forever, the light goes on for those who fell in battle. The gods will await him the moment he falls in the fight. He will rise when the sun goes down. He raised high his sword reality. 'Cause tonight, here we're right on the road to Valhalla, chosen to feast with the gods. 'Cause in the hall where the fire burns forever, the life goes on for the mighty young Viking. The journey has finally come to an end for the boy. He has risen as the bravest of them all. He is risen as the bravest of them all. Oh, he is risen as the bravest of them all. He is risen as the bravest of them all. Oh, Valhalla, oh, I hail you, mighty all forever reign. Oh, Valhalla, oh, I hail you, mighty all of battle slain. Oh, Valhalla, oh, I hail you, mighty all forever reign.
So yeah, anyone send any more questions? I didn't see any. But yeah, I like doing that and answering people's questions and all of that. But no, we got some good stuff coming up with CPI. And I guess there was some, what happened here? Like, I'm looking in the chat, in one of the chat groups I'm in. What happened here? I don't know if people saw, but the defense minister of Mali was murdered today by Al-Qaeda terrorists, right? And that, you know, the Union of Sahel States they're up against Al-Qaeda, and it's Al-Qaeda that's working for the West to try and fight against the new anti-imperialist governments. And the defense minister of Mali was murdered by the Al-Qaeda forces that attacked his home today. That was a very big loss for the Union of Sahel States. And I know Penny has done a lot of research. We stand fully with the Union of Sahel States. We're big supporters of theirs, and we're paying very close attention to that situation. So I did want to throw that out there. But listen, folks, it's getting late, and you know, keep your eye out for some exciting CPI stuff that I can't tell you about yet, but you'll be hearing about it soon. You know, hey, look, we're a real movement. Join the Center for Political Innovation. We're a real movement. There's a lot of internet phonies out there that harass people and defame people and act like children, but we're the real thing. We're really getting it done. So get involved with us and come to our 7-day training program in August. That's going to be cool. That's going to be awesome. And yeah, I'm going to put on the closing music, and I'll probably be back tomorrow night. If not tomorrow night, I'll be back again soon. So, but it looks like right now my allergies seem to be under control. So wish me luck on that. So yeah, we're going to put on the closing music. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, And the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today.